autonomy and the original intent of the Charter School Act. Since the start of the 2018-19 school year, Douglas County Charter Schools have been working diligently and collaboratively with our charter liaison, Daniel Winsler, to establish a variety of agreements among charters around automatic waivers, the renewal process, and teacher induction program, to name a few. In this spirit, the Alliance of Douglas County Charter Schools recently complimented the district staff during public comment on their willingness to work closely with charter schools to develop a transparent, fair, and consistent process for all charter renewals. Without a mutually agreed upon collaborative process, charters are prevented from having a voice and advocating for their needs, and this does not seem to respect the autonomy of charter schools. For these reasons and several others, you can imagine why we are so concerned about the board's approval of renewal requirements that most of us were unaware of until the January 8th meeting. As far as what's included in the renewal resolution, we question specific references to our enrollment mechanism, parent survey data, deadlines for strategic planning sessions, and our SAC minutes. Such specifics give the impression the board is wanting to dictate aspects of our operation that clearly do not fall under their purview. For the generally high-performing charter schools such as we have in Douglas County, these conditions feel unnecessary and unfortunately perpetuate an environment of distrust between charters and the Douglas County School Board. However, to be clear, charters are not at all opposed to accountability. In fact, we welcome it, but we believe oversight by the district should remain at the 30,000-foot level via a dashboard of indicators that are mutually agreed upon by charter school boards and the Douglas County School Board of Education, and executed by the Office of our Charter Liaison. To that end, excuse me, we are happy to report that the charters are currently working with our liaison to develop a dashboard that will provide high-level performance data on an annual basis. Tonight, we respectfully ask that the board rescind these new conditions as part of the resolution to renew and instead allow our charter liaison to continue the collaborative work already begun with the charters to create agreeable, renewable language that reflects the spirit, quality, and integrity of Douglas County Charter Schools, while also providing the accountability the board is seeking. Thank you for your time and thoughtful consideration of this request.
Thank you, Ms. Applin and Ms. Brown. Is Maurice Toole here? Oh, there he is. And then after Maurice is Gary Colley.
Good evening, board members. My name is Maurice Toole, and I'm one of the transportation supervisors here at the Castle Rock Terminal. On behalf of several drivers and transportation educational assistants, I'm super excited to share their thanks and appreciation for the pay increases, as well as the back pay for those affected by the freezes. In addition, the pay band increase has allowed us to hire several employees over the past several months. They were under the impression that the starting pay was $16.06, but when they found out it was higher, they were excited and grateful for the opportunity. Recently, we've been able to retain a lot of our employees as well because of that. So thank you.
Gary, feel free to come up to the front, in the front row. Good evening, Gary.
Good evening, you guys. Hey, I just want to commend, I know this is repetitive, but how many times I've been to school board meetings, but what is it, 15 months since you guys have been a full school board? And after what we've experienced over the past several years, it's refreshing. I know you're not perfect, contrary to some opinions, but my topic for discussion has to do with something on the board minutes from the last meeting. I wasn't able to make that work session, but other than that, there's nothing on the agenda I would speak to except this. But it really addresses how to address some issues of concern that the CAC has had with parents and staff over the years about how their issues have been addressed when they have them. So to highlight a couple points in the sub-ends that you were prioritized at your last meeting, which is really good, by the way. I've sat in on most of your work sessions for that. And it talks about quality educators and staff are being developed, supported, and respected. I added that word. A focused level of teamwork and professional development is going on among district employees and community. Multiple effective pathways for communication are available to everybody, parents, guardians, etc. And parents, guardians, families, and community members and district employees are treated with respect. This is where I've had kind of an issue over the past few years, but I know it's a topic that's being resolved, and you have to have time to get to it with bond mill levy, et cetera. So to support the positive intent of the school board and Dr. Tucker relative to each of these board goals, CAC requests to direct the superintendent, who's your only employee, to confirm and publish a clearly defined grievance process that ensures parents, guardians, teachers, staff, and community members are properly heard and supported when concerns arise. So I gave a couple of points here for consideration. I'm suggesting a clearly defined and articulated chain of command. That chain of command is mentioned throughout, but it's just a chain of command. It doesn't describe how processes are done. Also, if there would be a verification process that documents each step taken to address whatever that concern is. Also, consideration given to allow appropriate advocates to support those involved. I've been told sometimes, for example, an administrator won't meet with more than one person. Well, that's convenient, but not appropriate. Also, precautions to prevent the obstruction of any individual presenting their concern, no matter what level in the district. Now, if you're wondering why am I bringing that up, is because it's happening. Not as much, but there's still a culture that has to be corrected in a district. CAC also recommends focused professional development or training for all principals, executive directors of schools, and the assistant superintendent on how to appropriately address concerns raised by any individual, within the district. So just develop a process that can be easily monitored. You know, our staff doesn't have a union to represent them. I'm not advocating for a union. I'm just advocating for accountability and integrity behind issues of concern are addressed at the lowest level. So I could give you multiple examples, which I'm sure you wouldn't want to hear right now. But one good one would be if a principal dismisses the opinion or concern of a parent, and then it has to go to the DOS, and it's dismissed there too. It gets very frustrating. So I know you guys and Dr. Tucker and our assistant superintendent are capable of addressing that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Colley. Again, Aaron Johnson. After Aaron Johnson is Darien Wilson. Good evening.
Good evening, board members. Agenda item 12 tonight includes a report from the executive meeting on January 8th. Page 1, item 4D notes the board's prioritization of, quote, multiple effective pathways for communication are available to all parents, guardians, families, community members, and district employees, and are conducted with respect and kindness. This leads me to discuss the district's social media policy tonight. Here we are, a community incensed by a teacher's social media posts. Nobody wants to be here discussing this, but no matter how uncomfortable, we must confront this. I can't imagine what drove a teacher to make comments online that were hateful and bigoted, slanderous and vilifying, anti-Christian and misandrous. Now we're all left picking up the pieces that she broke. Every major employer in today's digital world must establish online policies that are clear. They should follow best practices to certify that employees understand them, and they should be enforceable. As the board considers item 4D, we now see the district's social media policies are ineffective. Ms. Grisham violated most of the provisions in the policy.
Excuse me, President.
It's obviously weak and lacks
Mr.
accountability.
Johnson.
It must be changed. In addition to 4D,
Mr. Johnson, if I could interrupt you for just a second, we've been
board
very
members.
explicit about no names being mentioned in our board meeting. So at this point, you are out of order, and would ask that you cease your comment, given that you violated the expectation that no names be mentioned in a slanderous way. Again, I'm going to ask you one more time, Mr. Johnson, to step away from the podium and tell you that you are out of order at this time. No one can hear you as you speak because your microphone is no longer inoperable. If you would please escort Mr. Johnson away from the podium from my request because of his violation with our policy that states that you cannot speak to a personnel issue, specifically name a specific person during this kind of forum. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Darien Wilson is next. After Darien Wilson is Roy Martinez.
Hi, I know what you're thinking. We know how Darien feels about start times, so why is she still talking? I promise tonight's comment is new content. Thank you for allowing me to speak. After attending a community meeting about start times and having some discussions on social media about it, I have a few thoughts to add to my last comment in support of later start times for secondary schools. First, I've asked you to consider the science. What I've heard from parents of younger kids is that we should consider the science for them too. And I agree wholeheartedly. The survey about start times, though, only offered 2 different start times for high school, but 1 for elementary. So I don't understand the logic behind that choice. If high school starts later, it seems like elementary school could too. So that didn't really make sense. Second, I just wanted to share that everyone I'm hearing from is very focused on the transition year. They're saying, look at Cherry Creek. What would teens do about jobs? What would I do about childcare? And I would encourage folks to please look at the areas where they've had late start times for some time. These problems can all be managed. They can be solved. And yes, it will present challenges, but a year or 2 later, when everyone has adapted, they're happy with the later start times. So look to the communities where it's been happening a while and don't just look at like the transition, which is, it's messy. So third, many staff don't seem to be aware of the science on start times. My teen and I have heard teachers and admin say, well, kids are just gonna stay up later if we start later, and current times work really well for most kids. Well, the sleep research shows that kids actually do end up sleeping more when they have later start times. And while the early start times do work for some, for other kids, like one of my teens, it can be devastating. So I wish more folks knew the science and knew some of these kids who really, really struggle with the early start times, and it's not parenting. Lastly, I wonder, do we have it in us to do hard things? It would be inconvenient at first, yet there's ample evidence that later start times for teenagers results in better mental health, increased attendance rates, higher GPAs, higher test scores, decreased car accidents, decreased sports injuries, less disciplinary action, among other things. Changing start times is inconvenient, without a doubt. But can we do hard things if they're the right thing? And my packet that, I'm sorry I handed you the packet, includes research from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, the American Psychological Association, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, the American Medical Association, and the National PTA, all of whom support later start times, in addition to the American Academy of Pediatrics, who I didn't include the research on that. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. Roy Martinez. After Roy is Brad Juan.
She was short.
Sorry, it doesn't work that way, Roy.
Well, let's
good try though.
let's turn around to something more positive. On agenda item number 5, I hope there's a time when we have to move this meeting to a bigger venue because there's so many people getting those awards. I think that's incredible.
Agreed.
I'm really here on behalf of kids, not just a charter school. So along those things, I think you should also recognize the fact that some of the schools, 7 in particular, have won that award every year for the last 5 years. It wasn't offered in 2015, but every year. And I'm not talking about just STEM, but I'm talking about there's 2 other charter schools, and there's district schools that are getting awards. Most of those are district schools. So if there's any way to acknowledge that going forward, I think you should definitely do that. So I had sent an impassioned plea by email to the board this week, but upon further review, I really think that What happened in terms of our renewal being 3 years instead of 5 was just an oversight, and I'm going to blame the lawyers for that, because they should have pointed out that the Colorado Department of Education rules require academic performance as the most important criterion, and that they specifically exclude community pressure. Now, I get blamed a lot. I'm a lawyer too, so I'm throwing myself under the bus for this, because I should have been aware of that at the last meeting. So with that in mind, I urge you to reconsider that 3-year renewal and change it back to the 5-year, and I'd rather it came from us than being told that we have to do that. So then the last thing I have is on item 12 of the agenda, you have minutes, and I have a couple of suggestions for amendment of the minutes to consider, and those are on page 7, item number 18, which regarded the charter renewal recommendation for STEM school. Towards the bottom, there's a couple of comments. STEM School Highlands Ranch Board President Alpert and Board Member Martinez share concerns with a renewal contract of less than 5 years. My request would be that you add because of the financial cost. And I sent around also a copy of the financial cost for us, how it impacts our bonds. The name of the advisor is Matt O'Meara with Choice Advisors, and he also told me to invite any of you to give him a call or to ask questions, especially Danny Windsor if he has questions about that. And then the last thing is add a comment saying that the board actually cited community concern as the reason for a 3-year contract. That's my request. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Martinez. Brad Juan.
I don't get his 20 seconds. I like this concept. Good evening, Board of Directors, President Ray, Superintendent Dr. Tucker. Good evening. My name is Brad Juan. I'm a resident of Douglas County since 2004. I have 2 children that have graduated from the school district. I have 2 children that are still in the school district at Mountain Vista. I would like to thank Tammy Taylor for the awesome job she did today. She orchestrated quite the event today, and we appreciate her and all that she does. I'm here to talk today about communications. Communications is not really what I wanted to talk to you about today, but because of the board policy, this is what I'm left with. Public comment is foremost the most important form of communication in our school district. It is the most valuable form of communication we have as citizens. This is our podium, and this is our mic, and this is our school district. We are the parents, we are the voters of this community. Years ago, myself and a friend of mine, we came up here to this podium, and we spoke to another school board about public comment being shortened. Most of you remember that. We were against it. We didn't come back very often after they shortened it. Okay, so we understand what it's like to have your time shortened. As a citizen, I'm here to let you know I'm not happy. I'm not happy that I'm being told that I have to go to talk through a teacher first, through a principal, and all the different levels that you're asking us to do, all the way up to the superintendent, just so that I can come to speak to you. I did not elect them. They are not my elected officials. This board is. So I do not expect to have to go through all those channels when I have a concern. You are a representation of the community inside the world of public education. Not having the right to come straight to you in public comment is unacceptable. I hope in the future you reconsider this policy that has been presented to the public. I hope you bring back public comment the way it once was. I am not happy that my voice has been silenced tonight. I'm not happy that the public is not going to know the whole story through the body of government which was elected. But I assure you that when I walk out of these doors, they're going to hear about it through the press. I thank you for your time. I also want to state that what just happened here tonight is unacceptable. A speaker should never be removed from this podium for doing their civic duty to speak to our elected officials. That is absolutely 100% unacceptable, and I hope the community sees it and realizes the injustice. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Juan. All right, next on our agenda is the consent agenda. Is there a motion to pass the consent agenda?
Motion to pass the consent agenda.
Second.
Motion's been made by Director Lung and seconded by Director Holtzman. Any further discussion?
You are hypocrites.
And seeing no discussion, we will take a vote for approving the consent agenda, which has 3 items: the 2019 financial plan and budget revised budget resolutions, the IGAs for both the Castle Rock School Resource Officers as well as the School Marshal Program. Seeing no further discussion, we will go ahead and take a vote. Chancho Shore.
Aye.
Graziano.
Aye.
Holtzman.
Aye.
Lemieux.
Aye.
Lung.
Aye.
Ray. Aye. And Vogel.
Aye.
Next on the agenda is to approve the unofficial minutes. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
I will make that motion for the second time.
Thank you,
But
Director
now,
Holtzman.
in the appropriate space, I make a motion that we approve the minutes.
Motion's been made by Director Holtzman. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Graziano. Any further discussion? Director Lemieux.
As requested by public comment, I do think it's appropriate that we add the request for renewal for 5 years was because of financial cost. If we could add that, that was mentioned, and I do remember that conversation. So I'd like that added to the minutes. And I would also, so I think we should add that. Thank you.
I'm going to first of all just pause for a moment to look at board directors to see if that was their understanding, and we will need to make a motion to amend if it's so moved. But so my first question, Dr. Lemieux is suggesting that the reason for approving the charter, STEM charter, for a 3-year renewal was due to financial reasons.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't make myself clear. What the reason they wanted 5 years was because of financial reasons, and they did state that to the board during that, and I think it's appropriate that that be added to the minutes.
Director Lemieux is making a friendly amendment, Director Holtzman, to include that the rationale for the public comment of requesting a 5-year renewal was due to financial reasons from STEM.
And I believe our board assistant secretary has something she'd like to say, if we could address her, please.
Yes, Tammy Taylor.
Thank you. Just point of clarification, Director Lemieux, Mr. Martinez requested 2 amendments to the minutes, one being that the reason they asked for a 5-year renewal was financial reasons, the second being the board cited community concern for the 3-year decision. Are you asking both of those items be placed in the minutes?
And I would just interject, Mrs. Taylor, no. Director Lemieux made a friendly amendment specifically on the financial rationale, and we will stick with that friendly amendment should there be agreement on the board. So again, the recommendation by Director Lemieux is to do a friendly amendment to include that STEM stated that there would be a financial hardship should they have only the 3-year renewal as opposed to the 5-year renewal. Am I capturing that correct, Director Lemieux? Director Holtzman, that's the friendly amendment. Do you accept that?
So, no, I don't, just because I don't remember every reason given during the discussion, and I think there may have been others, and because I want the minutes to be an accurate reflection, I think it now is. Although general, it's accurate. If we need specifics, we can definitely listen to the video. We can get specifics at a later time, but the minutes are accurate, and so I don't accept that.
So, Director Lemieux, the friendly amendment hasn't been accepted. You certainly have the prerogative to make a formal motion if you would like to have board vote on that addition to the minutes.
I understand the rationale that these are general minutes and that anybody can go back and listen to our archived live stream, so I'm fine.
So no motion in addition has been made and no friendly amendment has been accepted. Any further discussion about approving the minutes? Seeing none, we'll go ahead and vote. Chancho Shore.
Aye.
Graziano.
Aye.
Holtzman.
Aye.
Lemieux.
Aye.
Lung.
Aye.
Ray, aye. And Vogel.
Aye.
Okay. Next on the agenda is the Superintendents Report. Dr. Tucker.
Thank you, President Ray, Board of Directors, and our guests and visitors are still here. Have a few items. I promise you it will not take an hour. First and foremost, this regards our Mill Bond Oversight Committee. We're pleased to report that we received 156 applications from Douglas County citizens who are interested in serving. Yes, round of applause. These folks are interested in serving on the Mill Bond Oversight Ad Hoc Committee. As outlined during the December board meeting, we are forming an interview committee made up of our Chief Financial Officer, Chief Operating Officer, and representatives from the Douglas County School District Board of Education, Fiscal Oversight Committee, District Accountability Committee, Long Range Planning Committee, as well as 2 Douglas County School District educators. And we will be working with our Student Advisory Group to have a representative to serve on the Oversight Committee. And lastly, we're working to get the Oversight Committee members selected by mid-February so that the board can review the recommendations from the interview committee and approve those members at the February 19th board meeting. We are also well underway with choosing someone to help, or a group to help us lead with strategic planning. We are exceptionally proud of that. This Friday, our Chief Academic Officer, Mrs. Grouse Taylor, and that committee will have narrowed the group down to 2, and tomorrow we'll have someone selected to help us with strategic planning. And folks, again, we need your service as we begin planning for the next 4 to 5 years of our district. If you saw and felt some excitement tonight, just with our students and staff, we'll certainly experience more of that in the future. Also, I want to give you a quick update on the Employee Council. The Employee Council met last week to review applications from employees in selecting our additional members. We want to add on to that group. The council was extremely thoughtful and collaborative in reviewing and selecting our additional members, which encompass individuals with an eclectic experience across the board, all different employee groups. Communication regarding our added members will occur next week. So once they're selected, we'll get that out to our school community. And lastly, I want to reiterate a point I made earlier. Our focus in the Douglas County School District is helping our students to be college, career, and life ready. We have outstanding educators. We have over 4,100 teachers who represent all of our schools. We have nearly 4,000 plus other educators representing the administrative and support ranks. Folks, that's our focus, educating our students. We want to make sure that we listen to our community, that you are heard, that you have a voice. But our job is to make sure when Chloe graduates that she's ready to compete at any level in life. And we're not going to spend a whole lot of time worried about the noise in the background. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tucker. Board directors, any questions of the superintendent's report? And just want to acknowledge that we have Zoe Zizzo, not Chloe, but we're pleased to have Zoe representing Student Voice tonight. Zoe is the vice president for our student advisory group, and it's nice to have you back. We haven't seen you for a while, so welcome back. All right, so next on our agenda is a study work session item on school start time analysis. Back in October 2017, this board, and some of you weren't present when that occurred actually, but the board at that time approved a resolution to explore secondary start times. We revised that resolution to give us more time with the exploration, and because there were other things that we needed to focus on as a district last year, and so that was delayed, that analysis was delayed until tonight. And so we are looking forward now to see all the work that this group of great individuals in front of us have done to begin looking at the possibilities and the impact of changing school start times specifically for our secondary students, but also understanding that that impacts really all students in our system. So with that, I am going, I think our Chief Operating Officer, Rich Cosgrove, is going to lead the way. Welcome.
Good evening, directors. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present our analysis and recommendation on school start times. It's been a very collaborative team effort with everyone behind me, all cabinet members and staff represented. So at this time, I would like to basically introduce our analysis. And as the public may recall, in October 2017, the Board of Education directed the superintendent to present information and a recommendation concerning secondary school start times. And in February, the next year, there was a revised resolution. And specifically, it said for the earliest implementation in 2021 school year. And staff presented an update at that time with the proposed plan of action, and we have been implementing that action to complete our research. Basically, our research that we will be briefing today is based upon summary of academic and performance research, feedback from parents, students, and staff, from a survey, from board committees and the communities, from public meetings. We've done an impact analysis on transportation, fleet, and staffing, capital and operational costs, impact to programs, and other considerations.
Good evening, everyone. Dr. Stephanie Crawford, Director of Mental Health. So I wanted to go over the literature that we reviewed and the research to help with making a decision on this important topic. So first, if you look at, you have the sleep recommendations from, the American Academy of Pediatrics. And as you see there are recommendations for all of our students, from preschool to elementary, going on to our middle and high school students. And you'll see that there's a range, but they have a lot of sleep needs, just like everybody else. Additionally, in looking at the research, and I got to thank public comment, because she kind of helped me here in giving you a little review of what I'm about to go over. When you look at the research for adolescents, they need a lot of sleep, more than they probably thought they did. And they also have biology that has them go to bed later. And so you'll hear from some people that, well, the students will just stay up later, or they should go to bed earlier. But research shows that this group of students, the adolescents, need to go to bed later. That's just how their sleep cycles work as they get older. Additionally, when looking at early start times, or start times that are later for students, this is a really positive thing for them. So we know that there are a lot of good benefits for people who get sleep, and especially for our students. There are increased cognitive functioning. They have better thinking and decision making. There's increased with how they manage their emotions. And there's also a lot of great overall health benefits for our students. Additionally, we know if students are sleep deprived or not getting a lot of sleep, there are a lot of negative outcomes as well. And those include looking at maybe just their attention and not being able to focus during the day and stay alert. Also looking again at psychological distress and problems that they might have, as well as negative impacts to academics. And so there's a lot of research out there. The general research that has found so far as we're going through this is that there are good benefits to starting later for students, and it's for the whole student: academics, emotions, behavior, all of it. Additionally, in looking at the research, if a school district decides they want to go down this route, the best way to do that is to get input from all the stakeholders, everyone in our community, and to make sure that we're transparent in doing that at every stage of the way in this process. And really taking into consideration parent ideas, because there's a lot of great ideas out there, as well as their concerns. And some of them are concerns that we're going to talk about tonight of transportation. Some of them are concerns about parents and changing their family routines and their functioning. And then some of that is looking at after-school activities and sports as well. So that's the summary of the research that we did. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Good evening, directors. I wanted to start off with talking about some of the feedback that we gathered. The resolution called for us to gather feedback from a diverse representation of effective employee groups, also going through specific committees, so you'll see that throughout. So a couple of things for the survey aspect of it. We started this process basically back in November. The survey launched November 16th. We also, in between, while the survey was out, we also had a series of community meetings, which you'll hear a summary of in just a few minutes. The survey itself closed November 30th, and we were delivered the findings from Hanover on the 15th. So a few things about the survey itself. First, we wanted to look at creating this survey. We did it in conjunction with Hanover. We did a lot of collaboration between the two. They had several instruments that we looked at and we reviewed in order to create our own. Again, the survey was open for several weeks. During that time, emails were distributed to parents, staff, and high school students. We were just shy of the distribution amount of 100,000 emails sent out through those different stakeholder groups. So you'll see what the data is in just a minute. And parents had the ability to retake the survey multiple times for their children if they had multiple children. So we had almost 21,000 responses in the following categories. You had just over 3,000 students, over 14,000 parents, and over 3,300 staff members took the survey. And there's a distribution based on percentages of almost that 21,000. Hanover, and you guys have a copy of the full report from Hanover. They provided a recommendation, a series of recommendations. One of the recommendations is they recommended that we as a district continue to investigate starting specifically around preschool and elementary. The resolution calls for an exploration of secondary start times, but obviously if you're going to change one, you have to look at the logistical details of possibly changing the other. So that was part of their recommendation. Over half of the respondents indicated that they would support starting elementary school at that time, but there's also some more investigation that needs to go into that, some logistical details. Fewer support pushing the middle and high school starting times to 9 a.m. To push it back that late. There was fewer support of that because we provided several options for different schedules. One thing they did recommend is that we should consider the development and knowledge of sharing tools on both the study research on sleep and the survey results to provide those and make those public, which this meeting will help do that because they've been posted publicly. So students were less likely to agree that the current schedule positively impacts their readiness, mood, emotional state as compared to the other stakeholder groups. 31% of the participants, students, were surprised about the recommended sleep, and you'll see that as part of one of the keys as well, that they were surprised by the amount of sleep because we put that as one of the series of questions, just providing people knowledge about the research that's out there. Another recommendation is obviously with the change of start times is work on aftercare providers to assess what the needs would be from a staffing consideration, space, and other resources. They noted, parents specifically noted that this would impact changes very little on how they would get to and from school, but obviously with the impact of childcare afterwards was one of the considerations that was in the findings. So beyond just their recommendations, they provided several key findings. Like I said earlier, the majority of respondents support changing school start times at 55%. One key aspect is 47% were completely open as opposed to 24 that were not. That's the differentiated between your two extremes. The one thing that they did say in terms of transportation is it's not going to impact their decisions about what they're going to utilize for transportation, but they did note that you're going to have an increase based on the survey responses of the number of people who utilized the transportation services of Douglas County when they changed the start times, and that was one of the findings that they looked at. Sleep knowledge. These are the questions that relate to just giving people background knowledge of what the research says about sleep. Overall, all respondents were not surprised by the findings of the research. Only about 10% say that they were surprised to hear that students at that age need more sleep. The converse of that, though, is students at 31% were surprised. So even though overall it was 10%, our student population are surprised that they actually need more sleep, which is interesting. Students also self-reported that they rarely get 8 hours or more of sleep per night, at almost 90%. They reported that they get 7 or fewer hours of sleep per night. But parents, on the other hand, are at 74%, say their child gets at least 8 hours of sleep. And if you break that down by level, it breaks down that the later the kids are in terms of their age, the less likely their parents are going to say that they get the recommended amount. So 96% of parents of elementary students say that they get the right amount, 73% of middle school, and less than half, or 42% of high schools, says that their children are getting the recommended amount. Perceptions of current start times is something that we did ask. Students are finding that the current start times are beneficial for after-school activities. And you'll see that theme throughout, not only the survey, but also in the other feedback that we've gotten. And out-of-school activities include extracurricular, time for homework, time for part-time work, and those sorts of things, that the current structure that we have supports that. The parents and staff also find that as well, that the current staff, or the current start time and the current end time actually supports after-school activities.
We also held 3 community meetings, one in each planning area, and we asked all attendees to provide 2 things, basically. One, what questions would you like to ask the board? And the other, what are the key factors you would like the board to consider in this decision? And we had whiteboards up, butcher paper. We wrote down everything. We documented all of the notes. This was in your packet of materials. And basically, these are the themes that were discussed. And while everyone looked forward to the survey, they also mentioned the impact to students, families, childcare, the athletics and activities, the student jobs. So the non-purely academic aspects were discussed at length. They also discussed transportation, how would it affect, and they gave us their comments about drop-offs and walking and biking at the various age groups during the various times. And really about traffic, not only bus traffic, but peak traffic times and vehicular traffic when people come to and from work. This item was also presented to the 3 board subcommittees, and same themes, and it's not surprising that the Fiscal Oversight Committee and Long Range Planning Committee really raised the issue of the financial impact as well. But it was pretty consistent themes within the community. We looked at transportation and fleet staffing, and we made several assumptions. First of all, the analysis is based on current general education ridership. And if I may, I'll skip to the last bullet. Transportation of students with special needs is not included in the analysis because we will continue to provide that. And those routes will be scheduled based upon school times. Middle and high schools on joint campuses, we're assuming will continue to be slightly offset in their start and end times to mitigate traffic, somewhere 15 minutes to 20 minutes, for example. And you'll see this later on in our impact analysis, but we have several middle schools that aren't physically located next to high schools, and that's an impact on traffic. And we are assuming that preschool will remain aligned with the elementary school start times. So this chart summarizes the buses and drivers needed in the earliest pickup. So I'd like to define one thing, and that's a tier. So if a bus picks up students and takes them to a school, drops them off, then picks up other students and picks them up and drops them off at a second school, that's 2 tiers. So under the current start times, and these are general start times, we have schools on either side of this window in some cases. You know, every elementary doesn't start at 8:30 or 9:30, for example, and every secondary at exactly 7:30. So these are general times, but under the current start times, the earliest pickup is for secondary because the secondary schools start earlier. in general at 7:30. We do, however, have pre-K and elementary schools starting at 2 different times, and that gives us a little flexibility to actually have 3 tiers on some feeder systems. So we currently use 133 buses, 133 drivers. Now again, special education has drivers and TEAs, and that's not part of this analysis because that would be a constant to provide. Scenario 1 and 2 are those that were included in the survey, and we went ahead and provided 3 other scenarios, in part because of the feedback we received during the community meetings. And one of the questions was, well, why don't you start the elementary schools at 8 o'clock instead of 7:30? So we wanted to run that analysis for an informed decision. And so scenarios 1 and 2, we would have to add 33 buses. And in large part, if you look at your materials, our district has very different high school feeders, and the Ponderosa feeder and Chaparral feeder are very spread out compared to the Mountain Vista feeder, for example, and the Thunder Ridge feeder. In general, the more spread out it is, the more buses you need. And in fact, there's Ponderosa, Chaparral, and Legend, which are not physically located next to their middle schools. And that's why the numbers increase in those feeders, because you would need more buses because they're physically separated. Now this is the maximum. You'll see this later, but we're running up against a 4:15 deadline in order to avoid a traffic impact analysis. So we would want to continue to stagger the middle and high schools, but we could only stagger them so much if we started at a later time because we'd run up against a 4:15 time for traffic, the afternoon peak in the afternoon. So in all of the rest of the scenarios, you will see, well, in 1, 2, 4, and 5, the earliest pickup time is at the elementary level because those times are starting earlier. So the younger kids would be picked up earlier. That's a big difference in these scenarios. And scenario 3, if you started every school at the same time, you'd have 1 tier. So in essence, you'd have to double the transportation fleet.
Good evening, directors. The information on the slide in front of you is our estimate of cost impacts. The slides that follow, you'll get more detail on where some of these estimates came from. The biggest expenditures from a one-time basis, the first would be to light our athletic fields. If we are starting high schools later, finishing later, and practices and games are in the evenings, currently our practice fields are not lit, we would need to light those fields. Additionally, as Mr. Cosgrove just said, we would have to purchase 33 additional buses to fill the additional bus routes that he described. Along with that, on an ongoing basis, hiring 33 additional bus drivers is largely the cost associated with that $1.5 million. We're also estimating a loss of facility use rental revenue. So we rent our facilities whenever we are not using them, and the middle school and high school gyms are the facilities that we rent the most. And so based on those schools getting out later, there is 1 less hour for those facilities to be rented, assuming that our renters aren't going to stay 1 hour longer into the evening. So we'll have some more information on that as well. The last number you see on here is our estimate of childcare costs. Alicia Elmore, our director of Before and After School, will speak to this, but essentially with our elementary schools starting earlier, we project that our students will have to be in base longer after school, and the increased childcare costs that would be borne by our families if we were to make this change at the elementary level.
Good evening, directors. Derek Cheney, Director of Activities. So we're just one little piece of the pie, I get that, but I want to try to represent activities and athletics the best way I can. We gathered feedback from high school athletic directors, middle school athletic directors, high school activities directors, middle school coaches, high school coaches, sponsors, secretaries, student athletes. So collected a lot of information, and I'm trying to represent those groups tonight. I also got information from athletic directors and coaches and district ADs in Littleton and Cherry Creek School District because, you know, Cherry Creek's in their second year, Littleton just started, so I wanted to talk to them to see what was, how they were doing in Cherry Creek and Littleton since they're under that. Some of the concerns and drawbacks from the athletic and activity perspective, one thing I heard, and the concern is missing more instructional time. We already missed some to get out of school, but if you go to a later start time, you know, softball games start at 4 o'clock or whatever it might be, so we have to get those in. So our coaches are concerned, as our teachers, as what's happening in the other districts, is our students would miss more instructional time. So that was definitely probably the biggest concern about moving back the start time. Teams running out of daylight, especially for late fall practices and early spring. That was definitely a big concern. If you go late in the fall or the spring, I mean, it gets dark 5:15. If you won't get out till 3:30 or 4, that was a concern, and it was definitely a concern in the other districts as well. Running out of gym space in time. You know, gym space is at a premium during the winter months, not only for our own teams, but for facility use and working with our communities. And so it's gym time is difficult to come by, and if you go even later, that's going to be more difficult to come by. So that was a concern that we had. I talked to the other district, the stadium scheduling, for the same reason that gym time. You know, sometimes in our stadiums we have 2 or 3 events. We have to go back to back. How's that going to look? Is it going to be later in the evening? Now we're getting out of there at 10 at the stadium. How's that going to be? So that was definitely a concern, as well as the stadium scheduling. Was mentioned earlier, coaches and student athletes get home later in the evenings. Talking to the student athletes, that was a concern of them. You know, some of these kids are really involved, and they have a lot of homework, and they go to school, they go to practice, they go home. They're up till 10, 11 as it is. And you move that back an hour. There was a concern with time to do homework in the evenings, and then less time in the evenings for students, and coaches get home later as well. So those were some of the concerns and drawbacks from the activities and athletics perspective on the research I collected. Some of the benefits that we thought would help. Out-of-building coaches. You know, we do have quite a few out-of-building coaches, so it gives them more time to get to practice if we're not starting practice till 4 instead of 3. That was definitely a benefit that we see and that Cherry Creek and Littleton saw as well. They both acknowledged, both districts, that there were some drawbacks, but the impact, they both use the term, has not been major. Their participation numbers have not decreased. Their athletic performance, they feel, have not decreased. And, they say that the morning classes have been better, and the sleep has been more beneficial for their teenagers. So that was some of the benefits they felt from moving the start time back. Other factors to consider, I must have got this question like 100, 1,000 times. What about morning practices? Will we allow them? Will we not? On one hand, you could argue it defeats the purpose, right, of going to a late start. On the other hand, some of the facilities, I think of swimming, I think of hockey, some of these things that, we may need to try to go earlier. So that's something to consider. How would we answer that? Would we draw a hard line? Would we have some exceptions? So I think that's some coaches and student athletes would like to go early and practice before school. So we would need to look at that and address that. I heard over again to represent, they feel we have a good thing going in Douglas County right now. We're performing well academically, activities, athletically, kind of if it's not broke, why fix it theme I heard. And so I want to make sure I represented that. And again, just for our little piece of the pie, and I get there's a bigger picture out there. As a general rule, personnel from activities and athletics are against going to the later start time. We feel that the negatives outweigh the positives from our perspective. But if it is determined it's best for kids, just like Littleton and Cherokee Creek, we'll figure it out. Right? We'll make it a way to make it work, and we'll figure it out as well. So that's our perspective, activities and athletics.
Thank you.
Good evening, directors and Dr. Tucker. My name is Alicia Elmore, and as Scott said, I am here to talk to you about BASE. I am the director of the BASE department, and I did have the opportunity to go all 3 of the community meetings, and I know that childcare is important to our elementary families. It is a family issue, of course. So there is a financial impact if we change the start times for our families. In the fall semester, we served over 4,100 students at after school alone in BASE. So we know if we were to increase the times of BASE, we'd also have to increase the charges for BASE. So for the students alone that we've served already, that would be approximately an additional 3 hours, that's going to be $500 a student for each family. So for the families that we already have right now, that's $2.1 million a year for them for child care expenses that they would incur. And I will point out, these are for our existing families. If somebody has not actually been in BASE and they're going to need child care because of the change in times, that's probably going to be about $2,400 a student that they are not incurring at this point. So it is something to consider. But the impacts are not just financial for BASE. There's also an issue of our operational space. We know that our numbers for after school are very likely are going to increase with a change in time. We also know that all those school-sponsored activities like jump rope club and choir and what have you that are often in the morning and the afternoon are now going to all have to be in the afternoon. So we're going to have to share spaces like cafeteria and the gymnasium. Now, why is this an important big deal? We at BASE are required to have a certain capacity in each licensed room. We're licensed by the Colorado Department of Human Services. So, for instance, a cafeteria that may feed 100 kids at lunchtime, we may be only legally allowed to have 60 kids. So if then all of a sudden we can't use another part of the school and we're not licensed for all the parts of the school, that does create a real problem for us. And with that, we might have to cap some of how our enrollment, not be able to serve as many. The other thing that is involved here for us is staffing. We currently hire 77 or have 77 teenagers on staff. Those are high school students that are, most of them within district, that their jobs would be affected. We love having teenagers. We know our kids love having teenagers. It's a perfect time of day for them to work, but they would not be able to because the BASE would already start and they would still be in school. So they're going to lose out. Those kids will lose some of their own earning power, but additionally, then we'd have to fill with adults. That's a hard time period to get adults to work, and it would be more expensive for us. The other factor with that is our licensing ratios. The state also requires that for every 15 kids, we have 1 adult. Now, we try to operate at 1 to 12 in our district because that's recognized best practice, but we know that that could be a hard thing. And if we can't get there, we have to cap for that too. So again, the issues that involve BASE are around the ability to operate well and staff well, and the increased financial burden on our families. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is that right?
Let's wait till...
Wait to get in?
Yeah,
Okay.
we'll have questions after everyone's presented. Thank you.
Good evening, directors. I'm Janice Seisner, Director of Finance. So facility rentals is also a very small piece of the pie, but still a very important one. First of all, for facility rentals, we recognize that our school buildings are community assets. So we love opening those up for the community to be able to use for their purposes. We do charge rental fees, but those rental fees are to recover the cost of opening our doors. So it's utilities, wear and tear, staff costs, and we put that money right back into our schools. So the first thing I want to talk about is an IGA that we have at the town of Castle Rock. This IGA allows our school programs to use the town's pools, golf courses, fields for free. In turn, we open up our Castle Rock elementary schools and middle schools for the town of Castle Rock to use for their programming for free. So the effect that this would have is a little bit unknown, but it would definitely affect programming to some level. Either it's the town and their community programs, or the school district and the programs and our access to those facilities that they offer. Additionally, this might push those town activities into our other schools, which would again lower the ability for us to rent that space to other renters. So who do we rent to? We rent to scouts, enrichment programs, sporting organizations. So this would reduce our ability to rent that space for at least an hour. Definitely affect our ability for the community to interact with each other, use these facilities in a great way. We calculated that about $84,000 of revenue would be lost every year. That's just looking at our main gyms and our high schools and middle schools, so this effect could be much larger.
We also wanted to highlight other considerations, most importantly, student impact. Elementary school students will have to walk to bus stops in the dark during certain times of the year, and there are some neighborhoods in the county that do not have streetlights. Elementary school students may eat more breakfast at schools if schools start earlier, since they may not eat at home. That's a possibility, and breakfast is currently served in 17 of our elementary schools. Also, elementary school students could need to go to bed much earlier in order to get enough sleep because of the early start time. For transportation, hiring and retaining bus drivers may not be possible to cover the additional buses. Cherry Creek School District, in a robust funding and climate for transportation, purchased 30 buses, and they are short drivers. Now, those buses could be for other value added, for replacement buses, but they also change their school start time, but they are short drivers, just like we are. And we have received applications, and we're trying to retain, and thank you for the pay raise, but we are still short on drivers. Changes in school start times could impact traffic closer to peak travel times. Littleton Public Schools is experiencing traffic congestion because of the change in school start times. Space will be needed to park additional buses. One possibility is underutilized schools, and those parking lots could be used. We already park buses at 3 of our schools. They are not lit, they're not secure. Fortunately, there's been no issues, but that's one area that we would need to explore. And delivery time for a bus is 6 to 8 months. Lighting, athletic site amenities. Littleton Public Schools, 3 high schools, they are planning on lighting field amenities at 2 of their schools. The other school has a district stadium on its site. So they are already planning on that. For us, it would take design, permitting, construction 12 to 18 months to light fields, and the cost per type of field amenity is in your packet of materials. Communities do not support exterior lights. Typically, when you light a field or have off-site impact, including light, that requires approval from the local planning commission and the town council. For example, when we built our stadium in Parker, that had a first and second reading to Parker, and there was strong opposition against the lights. And that is a public process and a public referral process. Traffic. We met with all land authorities, all traffic engineers, and the bottom line is if our schools release no later than 4:15, we do not need to do a traffic impact analysis. If it's later than that, then we would. Well, the latest scenario in the survey, starting at 9 o'clock, ended at 4:15. So that was very positive news, but that was part of our due diligence we wanted to provide. Employees, changing work schedules and potential subsequent impact to culture, climate within the district, and impacts on their personal family schedules. Local businesses. Some businesses provide extracurricular activities, clubs, programs to school-age children, and that may be impacted by changing start times. Also, employers who have employees, either adults or students, whose schedule may need to change based on changing school start times. And last but certainly not least, choice. Different start and end times for neighborhood and charter schools may impact choice.
To wrap up from a financial point of view, just want to make the point that the estimates that I provided previously are probably the minimum cost estimates if we were to move into this fashion. And the reason I say that is some of the examples that you see on the screen. Transportation. If we can't recruit bus drivers, we either have to increase pay or utilize third-party transportation, which is incredibly expensive to do. Obviously, with 33 more buses, increased maintenance, support staff, mechanics, those additional positions that would probably have to come with it. Our before and after school programs, as Alicia mentioned, if we can't recruit people into them, raising the pay for those positions as well to try to recruit employees. The before and after school program is a self-sustaining enterprise, so that is a cost that would be passed on to our families if we did have to increase pay in order to recruit those positions. Anything that we do from an operational perspective, for instance, hiring additional bus drivers, that just dilutes our available resources for compensation increases or for additional programming or other things we want to do. As I often say, there's only one bucket of money. And obviously, as you look in the context of our budget, $1.5 million on an ongoing basis, if that is the actual cost, is doable. But that does come at the cost of something else. There's an opportunity cost that we would have to consider. Same thing on the capital expenditure side. You could repurpose bond dollars to light fields and buy buses and do these types of things, but that just reduces our ability, again, that opportunity cost of addressing more projects from the master capital plan. So just want everyone to understand that these are our best estimates right now, but there are scenarios where those costs could increase or come at the cost of other things that we could be investing in within the district.
We are providing 4 options in our analysis. One is to make no change to the current school start times. The second one is, as recommended by Hanover Research, to continue to investigate starting our preschool and elementary schools at 7:30 and our secondary schools at 8:30. Scenarios 3 and 4 were those scenarios that were presented in the survey to our community, and that is starting preschool, elementary schools at 7:30 and secondary either at 8:30 or at 9 o'clock. Staff's recommendation is to make no change to current start times for all schools because of 2 key factors. One is the cost, one time, annual, ongoing, and to the community, and also to the consequences of changing start times. The earliest bus pickup times would be for preschool and elementary students, our youngest students out getting on the buses at the earliest hour. Second, impacts to the benefits of the current start times, all that we presented for students, parents, and community. And last, the impacts to operations of transportation, athletics activities before and after school, and facility rentals. At this time, we would ask for questions.
All right. First of all, thank you. Well laid out, very logical, very, I think, a great analysis. So thank you to this entire first row. You guys are a great team. Board directors, what questions do you have regarding the presentation we've heard tonight? What questions? Director Lung.
I have a couple questions about the base camp.
And Dr. Lung, if we can refer to a slide, if you are looking at a slide, just so the public can see it as well.
The one that say 3 hours, additional 3 hours of course. I forgot what's the number of the slide, sorry.
It's not on the bottom of your...
Oh, well.
Your slide.
18.
18.
18.
No, let me see. Sorry.
This one?
23?
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
Perfect.
thank you.
Sorry. Well, my kid used to enroll to the base camp before and after. So I'm just a little bit confused because isn't it just a wash? You know, if you change the time, then that means that they decrease. For example, you know, if it's elementary school, currently they start school at, say, 9, okay? And then if you switch it earlier, that means that they're not going to lead the 2 hours before care, then they're going to substitute the after care. I thought it's a wash, but you know, I saw your recommendations or your comment. You said it's actually the parent need to pay 3 hours more. So I'm just not quite understand why that would be a net cost to that. That's my question number 1.
Okay, hang on to that one. Alicia, go ahead, and if you'd answer.
Well, the reason is because we cannot presume that if a family needs after-school care now, if they need to pick up their family or their children at 6 p.m., we cannot presume that just because we change the start times, they're going to be able to change their work times. So we did with what's existing.
So how do you get that 3 hours?
The $3?
No.
Yeah, 3 hours.
The confusion is,
Right.
what Director Lung is asking is that if you're not having to daycare kids so much in the morning because they're starting earlier, why isn't it just a wash?
Well, because we don't know whether or not families will have a wash for their schedules. Some may be able to adjust, but we don't know that for sure. If they're a family that they get off work at 5 p.m., they can't necessarily change that, whether or not they go to before school or after school. They may still need to go to before school. So it's not necessarily, and even if they are just at after school, we decided to just focus on that piece of that. Because I know what you're saying, if before school was a little less, would that be a wash for those families? but not necessarily. We can see from our numbers that we have more students who attend after school than before school.
Director Lung?
Well, my second question is that since Cherry Creek and Littleton has already implemented that, should they face similar issues? What's the solutions for that?
I have talked to my counterparts, especially in Cherry Creek, and they have had some real issues, to be honest with you. One of them is the amount of children who are coming to after school and truly this amount of space that they have. Almost, I think what can happen is that if you're trying to get all of these kids in a particular area so fast and you have less spaces, it can become almost a crowd control issue. So that's what they're seeing. They are definitely seeing a huge increase in their after school.
Any other questions, board directors, on BASE, first of all, before we move off of that? And that's the topic that Alicia's addressing. Any other questions specifically about BASE? Okay. Other questions? Director Vogel?
Slide 11, and I think this is going to be for our data guy, Mr. Reynolds. I think it is. Somebody may have a better answer. I remember several years ago when we did a survey, and I can remember when we were going over results, I can't even remember who it was sharing with us that you could have a majority of people in a survey that say, yes, they support something, but you have to look at the percentage of people that say, no, I'm absolutely against it, because there's kind of this critical number where, and I want to say it was like between 5 and 8% that you're pretty okay. You start getting into the 10 and 12%, and you're going to have people that are going to start rumbling, and then when you get over the 20% that are absolutely against, you've got a movement. Does that ring true?
Yeah, I believe you're referring to the community survey several years ago, when he was describing when something becomes an issue when it goes beyond that 20% mark, and that's just general PR is what he was referring to, which you're right. I mean, once you get beyond that 20%, these respondents here are done in a vacuum because we only provided 2 scenarios and we didn't cover every one of the logistical details. So with that 24%, those people are making that that decision without knowing the logistical details, which may be hindering making that decision. And so you're absolutely right.
Other questions specific about the survey results? Director Lemieux?
So was financial impact part of the survey? Did we have any information that how much this would cost the district?
Not the specific dollar amounts. That was something that we were doing in addition to the survey. The survey had a couple of different criteria, and we didn't give them a flat dollar amount that things were being changed.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Director Graziano?
Just based on the number of respondents that you received, would you say it was a valid survey? I mean, that's always a concern, right, when you're going out and polling a community. Did you feel like the results enough respondents to make this a legitimate number count and such?
Well, we had just short of 100,000 emails sent out, and we had over 20,000, so that's 1/5 or 21%. That's a pretty good sample. We didn't do any statistical analysis to see if this was a representative sample. This was really just who was able to respond. That's something we can certainly look at, but that's a great response rate for most surveys is 20%.
Other questions? Director Chancho-Shore?
20% is, I'm hearing you say that's a great response. Then there were public meetings, and if I remember correctly, and I can't find the slide that showed the number of respondents at the public meetings, but it was a really small amount. Like 2 people and 9 people came to the public meetings, 2 attendees, 9 attendees. That's where I'm having some concern about input and community understanding of what this would really mean. And so I guess my question, how is that advertised? Or really the question would be, how would we get more community input, more community response?
So nothing's quite done in a vacuum. So these community meetings, really the target audience for these are those folks that didn't have access to the survey. So we put advertisements out there and publicly posted it on our website to get more involvement. We would totally want more engagement than just this small number. But this engagement was also done the exact same time that the survey was out. In a great scenario, it would be nice to be able to spread these out at a longer period of time so that you're not detracting people from attending these because they're taking the survey.
Okay, Director Lemieux.
We also directly spoke to athletic directors, coaches, other folks. I'm noticing staff members in Douglas County School District on slide 8 were about 16% of the respondents. Does that include the folks that we reached out to in other ways, or is this just from the survey?
Just from the survey.
So there were staff members from all kinds of areas that responded to this in addition to the other folks that we heard?
Correct.
And then do we know how many others we heard from that we directly reached out to, like through the athletic department?
If you're asking with all the athletic directors, so the 9 high schools, the 9 middle schools, the activities directors is 9, all the athletic secretaries, all those schools, and I would say probably about 75 coaches responded that I put it out to.
Other questions specific to, first of all, the survey results, and I guess I have a quick one. Matt, I noticed that you haven't disaggregated the data by the population necessarily, like looking at parents separate from students, separate from teachers, and although we have a couple of points where students have, you made a summary statement about students' preference about keeping the times current. Was that are the points that we are seeing are the ones that are more the remarkable kinds of things as far as those subgroups, or are there other trends in those individual populations that might be important for us to know about?
Great question. These are the results of Hanover's review of the survey data. You all have access to the data supplement where you can go and disaggregate the data more. This is what their inspection of the data, where they have a 99% confidence based on what they're reviewing. This is what they're seeing in their review of the data. You all have access to dig deeper if you so wish.
So would we assume that Hanover would have highlighted another summary point if they had seen something extraordinary?
Yes, if there was something specific that they thought was significant, they would have highlighted in either their key findings or their recommendation.
Very good, thank you. Director Holtzman? Okay, yes. Before we go to Director Holtzman, any other questions about the survey results? Okay, seeing none, Director Holtzman.
So I'm just wondering, how was the research, how was that shared with our community that Dr. Crawford basically summarized for us over the past year? How was that shared, for instance, with our athletic directors and the secretaries, that their opinions were gained with the parents?
Hi. So, you have in your packet a summary of research, and that's made public now. There's some in the Hanover survey, a little bit of information about sleep and people's knowledge of that. I think it would be a good point to share that to a wider audience at this point to make sure everybody got all of that research.
Dr. Holtzman?
All right, Dr. Crawford,
Yes.
This is really for you too. So
Sure.
You did mention a little bit about the effects of getting the appropriate amount of sleep for adolescents and for children on their social and emotional, their mental health, and the improvements. Do you think that we have a need to improve that in Douglas County and in Colorado as a whole? Not that we're making a decision for Colorado, but I know some data for Colorado. I don't know it's specific to Douglas County. Like, what does that need look like? And we know the research shows that, adolescents have biological changes to their circadian rhythms. It's not, I haven't seen where it's contradicted. So knowing that, and knowing that it could be something that could help someone, especially in those areas that somebody that might be having issues, how many students in Douglas County need that? Or how important is that?
Right. I think you ask a great question, and in looking at the research, right now it's very new research, so there's not longitudinal studies yet to say greater outcome. The preliminary research does show that this is good for our secondary students. Research also is out there saying this is, later start times are good for all our kids, making sure they have enough sleep. So that would be what's out there from the research. And then the other part of that would be looking at the information people have shared to say, do we have a need in our district? You know, looking at our discipline, our grades, and all of those factors to see, is that something specific to us in this district? So, yeah.
One of the things I do want to point out is to your point, one of the recommendation is for us as a district to share more information regarding start times. That was one of the recommendations from Hanover, is that we engage the community in sharing research about sleeping patterns, and that was one of the recommendations that they saw based on the survey data. So,
Director Lemieux.
Although a huge percent were not surprised about the sleep, so I think we have a pretty aware community, as we've heard from community members. My question is are there any other tools we could use? Because clearly this board has expressed and very clearly put a high priority on the mental health of all of our students. We know that suicide rates are some of the worst in the state of Colorado, and we have suffered from that, and one child is too many. That said, if the recommendation and it becomes unbelievably difficult to do, but we do support the mental health of our kids, is there anything that we could do in lieu of changing start times?
Again, I think that's a great question, and that's something that we could look into of what are other options out there. There were some great ideas out there about different options for our students than just 4 or 2 options for start times. What's the flexibility? Because as some people have said, everyone's an individual too. So what works for the good may not work for the all, and so do we have flexibility to make changes for our individual students? Also looking at, we could look at all kinds of factors of what's making our students not sleep in this community. Is it because they're coming to school too early? Is it because of other activities they do? Is it because of homework? What is it that we can do? So I think that's a great question that we could explore in looking at further recommendations. Yep.
Director Vogel?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you all. I mean, I know this was a massive undertaking, and I know it was a lot of work, and I thank you all for being so diligent about it. I want to push a little bit farther, though, about the flexibility piece. And would it be possible for us to do, yet again, more work, but look at the possibility of flexible schedules? And this might be a high school scheduling nightmare, I don't know. But could we look at a system where where we don't change any of the times, but we offer say staff that want to opt into an hour later start time and students that want to opt into an hour later start time. And so then you can still, maintain transportation and our current expenses as they are. And then, activities, athletics, all that stuff would remain the same as well. But then staff and kids would have the opportunity to opt in if it worked better for their schedule. And I don't, I'm thinking about high schools would have to survey and find out how many students would take advantage of that, how many staff would be willing to, and all that kind of stuff.
So part of my organization includes bell schedule times and things of that nature. I definitely think it's possible, so please don't take my comment this way. We have to be incredibly careful with that. As you may remember, our audit from CDE a few years ago resulted in us paying back a few $1 million. The way that student time is counted in the state of Colorado is incredibly complex because we were operating with a School Finance Act from 1994 that doesn't honestly fit today's educational model, but that is the way students are counted and funded. So it's definitely something we can look into. I just want to caution the board that the more complexity that you add into student schedules, because it's on a student-by-student basis, increases our risk in terms of funding through the School Finance Act.
Thank you. Other questions? Mr. Cosgrove, I know that you guys did a great job at analyzing our neighboring school districts that have changed to a later start time for secondary, and I've heard that through the transportation perspective and the after schools perspective, but is there anything else that we can learn from our neighboring districts specifically in terms of student achievement? Are they monitoring now that they've made that change to see if it's had an impact? on student learning or anything for us to learn on regarding student achievement?
Yes, that's a great question, and yes, they are. It is not complete, and Nancy Ingalls and I are aware, and in fact, they recently presented earlier this month to their board an update, but it was not complete.
Okay.
So that is still pending, and I believe that's at least a year away.
Hello. So the Cherry Creek School District has partnered with National Jewish to do a multi-year study on this. And through that multi-year study, they're working together to collect data and have some benchmark reporting periods. So most recently, the update that Mr. Cosgrove mentioned was that they surveyed a representative sample of students, parents, and staff, and they collected some preliminary data on the change in the amount of sleep that parents and students are reporting, and then some anecdotal sort of attendance and engagement perceptions from staff from those first period classes. But they will be looking at achievement over the long term. It's just going to take a much longer period of time to collect that data.
Very good, thank you. Director Lemieux?
So he mentioned surrounding districts, but what about national? What is the national research saying for other states that have already done this?
The research that we reviewed noted positive trends in achievement, but it wasn't very specific on what districts or what part of the country they were talking about. A lot of the research does include anecdotal data, so that is self-report from parents, teachers, and staff about things like improved school culture, observations of decreased stress among students, but very specific longitudinal studies on achievement, we haven't exactly seen.
Director Vogel.
And I was just going to comment on that. It's not so much a question, but I think that, that's a tricky thing because correlation doesn't imply causation. So we don't really know if just because it's going together doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's causing it.
Board, other questions? Or this is a work session, so we can certainly engage in discussion as well. But other questions for our team? Any other questions? Okay. Let's, so board, really, we have some, as Mr. Cosgrove presented, we have several options to react to this study. Tonight, we certainly don't have this as an action item, but it is a learning item for us to decide what we want to do from this point on. And certainly, as Mr. Cosgrove suggested, we can go anywhere from not taking action to asking for additional exploration if there's things we feel like we still need before we can make a decision, or we can certainly come back to this board with a resolution. The resolution as it reads right now, regardless if we were to make a decision, it would not go in effect until the 2020 school year. But I would just engage us now into some thoughts about where do we go from here? What have we learned in terms of what might inform our next steps? Director Holtzman and then Director Chancha-Shore.
So I think you guys have done a great job. It's so comprehensive. I really appreciate it. The one thing that's hard for me is that, the science is solid. And it has been that way for a while. I know this because of reading the research you provided, and as a child development person, I've known about this also. And so I know that we have kids in our district that could really benefit from this. And I would love to be able to give parents the choice of a later start. Obviously, there would be some parents that or some students who may choose to go to swim practice at 7:30, and that might not be something we can do anything about. I have a child that probably, that's what would have happened, so I get that. But if we rule this out completely, we are taking a choice away from students who might benefit from this a great deal. As Director Lemieux mentioned, we have serious mental health, social emotional issues in our district that we need to pay attention to. So it's hard for me to just say, well, it's really hard to do. So, you know, I feel like we need more information. I know you've already gotten a lot, but I also think just more time to educate our community. We asked them, and I think Director Lemieux is right, we have a very well-educated community, but I've heard comments that, you know, maybe even our staff, just as we move forward with our goals on mental health, I think that doing more education efforts just about the research and then getting more concrete data about our budget items, like about the BASE program. We have made, I'm sure, you know, great assumptions, but we can probably get a lot more detailed information. We can look at our 1920 budget and see if it's feasible at all. You know, right now we're just kind of knowing that it's a lot of money and we may not be able to, but I'd like to have more data before we actually make a decision. So,
Thank you. Director Chancha-Shore?
So I completely agree with Director Holtzman. I'm responding to the research that we do have that indicates the need for more sleep for our students. I'm also responding to we had a lot of information presented and a lot of good data presented based on how it impacts lots of areas of our school district. But I'm still missing something. I'm missing, for me, more parent input and more student input. I know we had, you know, statistically, and statistically 20%, 15% of the students just isn't enough to make a big decision like this. For me, that's just not. Statistically, maybe it's enough, but as I respond, it's just not enough for me. I would love to have more opportunity for students to speak regarding this topic one way or another. I'd like to have more opportunity for our parents to get the data, get the information, get the sleep studies, and be informed before. I know we always feel this huge crunch to make decisions, and we get pushed to make decisions quickly, and I am not willing to change. I'm not willing to make this decision without our parents and our students having more time to ponder their need and their desire, and then be able to hear about that. I think we heard all the other components really well represented, and I was happy to get that information, but I'm missing the human aspect of what we're asking.
Very good, thank you. Yeah. Director Graziano and then Director Long.
I would just add amazing work by the team. And so the way I'm looking at this is that we have all these buckets to consider. We have students to consider. We have their families to consider. We have transportation. We have athletics and activities. And then ultimately we have the cost of pulling all this together. And one of the things that just jumped out at me was, as Director Vogel pointed out, was the number of people that just flat out said were not interested. So that doesn't mean, though, that potentially they would not be interested. So like Director Chancha-Shore said, this is a systemic, a massive change to the district. And any kind of massive change that you want to implement across our districts of our size, I think still requires an amazing amount of communication and outreach to start this conversation. This is not something that I think can just happen with a flick of the switch. I mean, there's a lot of great things in there. I do think this is a conversation that if we need to start having, we have a lot of education in place that I don't think a lot of people know about. So I think it's time to start socializing this so more people can hear about this and understand the research and the impact and understand the costs and understand what it may mean for their family and how it may help their student do better. So I think like Director Chancha-Shore, I am for further research and engagement with our community to understand more about this.
Director Long?
Well, again, I echo the other directors. Thank you for the massive undertaking that you did to give us these presentations. I also echo the other directors' concern because the science is very solid. I read some of those reports. I have 3 teenagers myself, so I know waking up in the morning is a really not good for them. So from my personal experience and from what I saw in the research, I just have not seen this report. Some of you has already tell me that it's very hard to quantify what kind of benefit it is to delay the start time. I do want to know if there's any concrete evidence to let me know one way or the others the science is truly good, that this is helpful. So I would also like to see more study of that, namely the data behind why those CDC said that it's a great things and all the other researchers great things. How do they draw their conclusions, and why we cannot see a concrete data, even though those researchers said that it is actually good for a teenager. So that's number one things I want to see is a data to prove or disprove what CDC and the other researchers said that it is great. Second thing, another school district in Colorado just passed the changing the start time in late November in the PSD. So in the last 2 years, this is the third school district that has decided to make the changes. So the questions I asked a while about the before and after care, how the other school district manage to be able to make that work. I would like to see a little bit more study on that to learn from the other school district, especially now we're going to have the third school district that come to these decisions next year. I think there's a lot of things we can learn about that. I know that we're probably going to lose some teenager to help out, in the afternoon, but that means that some of them can help out in the morning because obviously if they later the start time to 9 in the morning, they could help out. So I again, I just want to see more cost and benefit, analysis. I know that taking care of the child is very important things. The before and after care programs is very, very important for some of the parents. So I would like to see a little more study to see how the other 3 school districts solve the problems, or if they cannot solve the problem, why the parent doesn't seem to have a big concern or ask the school district change it back. Because parents, they're very vocal in those 2 school districts I know. So they don't just sit there and take whatever the school board asks them to do. And also, mainly I want to see how we can help, the teenagers' brain development and minimize the mental health issues, which is the main benefit I see from those reports. Thank you again. Thanks for your work.
So last 3 comments, Director Lemieux, Director Holtzman, and Director Vogel, and then I want us to wrap this up. Go ahead, Director Lemieux.
Thank you. We had some pushback on why is this taking so long. That's incredible. You guys did an amazing amount of work. You've done everything you asked us to do. So of course we're going to ask you to do a little bit more. The good news is we've got until the 2021 school year to do this. So I think it is right that we do this comprehensively. And we have to have buy-in if we do it, and we also have to have understanding if we choose not to. So I appreciate the patience of our staff and the diligence and their understanding and why we're being so diligent about this. I personally was shocked by the financial cost, not only just those one-time costs, but also the ongoing costs. So I think as we communicate this out, that needs to be part of the conversation, because if we do decide to do this, we have to have that buy-in for that and justification of why we are the fiduciaries for this district. So we need to make sure we're paying attention to that. So I'd like to have the cost really communicated out there as we do a little bit more communicating with our families, with our teachers, and with our extended family, our community. And then my second one was, is the state moving towards this anyway? I know other states are contemplating, I think California is making it a mandate that, all of their secondary schools start at 9 o'clock. Are we moving to that? Do we know the politics of this? Is that going to be something we need to do anyway, and should we be preparing for it? So those would be my two questions that I'd like to add. And again, I just cannot thank you enough. This was one of the most comprehensive presentations I've seen. So thank you all for every single department that was involved in this. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Holtzman.
So if we do ask, and I'm not sure if I'm talking to the board or talking to, if we do ask you to continue and help us more with this work, I guess, my desire would be that we focus on options, even on how to meet the mental health needs of our students. We know this is an option that's backed by sound research. But, if it doesn't end up being the option we can take, just like Director Vogel said, look at things like flexible high school schedules, parent education efforts. And then I'm wondering, too, about things like, what do we tell our educators about appropriate amounts of homework? If we're not able to change a start time, is there something we can do to help get more sleep with more appropriate amounts of homework? And I'm interested in knowing what kind of guidance we give our staff, and if there's a way we could improve and increase our students' sleep through that. So just kind of as you go forward, I think those are three things that would help focus on meeting needs. But that's really what I'm interested in, interested in meeting those very significant needs. I mean, they're very, very significant. Not only just in if it affects one student, but it affects more than one student in our district. And so thank you.
Very good. Director Vogel.
Really nothing. I was just going to see if board members would support. I know everybody's asking for more information, more feedback, but I'm wondering if everybody would support having staff look at that flexible, the option, not just the options about mental health, but looking specifically at that flexible schedule and allowing people to opt in. Because I'm concerned about the cost, especially after we just asked our community to increase taxes. I'm concerned about the excessive amount of cost.
I would suggest, as we're moving forward, I mean, I look at some very tired folks that have worked hard on this and would love to be able to say done and move on. And I think what we know as a board is that when we align this to a focus that is already part of our system, that's when we do our best work. And so I want us to be careful, too, that we're not doing these random kind of go out and explore this, go out and explore this. However, I do think that there is definitely some validity in saying, how do we align this to our strategic planning process? For strategic planning around mental health, we see a lot of indicators, and Director Vogel and several of you have suggested some creative solutions that may respond to that. But I think we want to be careful that we don't string these guys out further unless it truly is aligned with that focus of what is our primary plan in terms of strategic planning for what's best for our kids. So I would suggest that that you certainly have heard that the board is very open to continuing exploration, continuing to have a lot of other voices, with this information. And I think where we would leave it is we'd love for staff to come back and kind of give us a recommendation of where you want to take this conversation that you've heard. And if it is to embed it into our strategic planning process, I think you would get a great deal of support for that as well. So I would suggest that unless, I think we need to close this conversation down, but board directors, certainly, if you feel strongly that there's some action, I would suggest we put that on the agenda for next meeting or to make a motion for action. Otherwise, I think exploration and aligning to our strategic process is what I would say we should move towards. Director Vogel?
Well, and I don't disagree with what you're saying, but I would also point out the fact that staff did come with a recommendation, right? And so I think that, that portion of it needs to be closed. I suspect that, you know, Dr. Tucker has heard what our wishes are, and given that staff has made that recommendation, I think that, you know, let him align his strategic plan and decide what he wants to do moving forward. But I don't know that that's something that we need to prolong, unless people have a great desire to do something different other than what staff recommendation was.
Well, it's listed as a work session item, and certainly at any time, because this is on our agenda, board can make a motion if you're making a motion to accept staff's recommendation or a motion not to. So I'm at the mercy of all of you in terms of how we want to move forward. If you feel like that there's an action item that needs to be done now, please make a motion, and if not, let's allow Dr. Tucker to come back and talk about what staff have discussed in response to the conversation they heard tonight. Dr. Lung?
Well, actually, in slide 31, it does give us 4 options. And if I hear correctly, I think everybody is probably want to do number 2, which is continuously investigating, starting. So, should we?
Is there a motion there, Director Lung? Feel free to make one.
If it's allowed, that I think, I don't even know whether it's a lead the motion, because it seems like there's a consensus to ask the staff to take option number 2, which is continuously investigate. I'm surprised, you know, because this is an info items, and I saw options that's being presented for us. But since they present to us, so I would think number 2 seems to be what everybody.
So Director Lung is suggesting that we're at consensus to direct staff, or direct Dr. Tucker to direct staff to continue investigating. Is there, I would just ask, is there anyone that's opposed to that consensus and that agreement? Director Vogel?
You know, I'm kind of opposed to it at this point, simply because I don't think there's clear direction. I don't think there's any clarity for staff at all about what exactly there is to explore. I think there's been lots of things talked about, but I don't know that it's been anything specific.
So we're not at consensus to move forward. Dr. Tucker, did you have any thoughts before we bring this to a close?
Just 2 quick observations. I certainly agree fully with some of the comments that have been made by directors. I would ask our student panelists, what are your thoughts?
Well, I've seen firsthand the impact that lack of sleep has had on students, and like their lack of motivation, and their losing their love for learning. And it's just really hard to say, yes, this is good, or yes, this is bad. I'm honestly shocked by how much money it would be just moving start times back. But I think it is really something to be considered.
Okay. And the second thing, we have to look at school districts being individual districts. It's not to say that we can't learn from experiences from other districts, or we can't go about and not value the research. But districts are so different. And not only are we thinking about the one-time cost and ongoing cost for transportation, we have to look at our busing philosophy. I mean, do we have the capacity not only to purchase additional buses and hire additional drivers, do we have the capacity to maintain a fleet? Because this simply, I think right now, Mr. Cosgrove, what is the ridership? 20%, I believe? A little less than 20%. What happens if the ridership goes up to 40%? Because the kids are taking off to school, which means they need additional transportation. So I don't want us to get totally captured by the research. Again, I'm saying we don't dismiss it, because we're in the business of children, and we'll continue to bring our thoughts, and we'll continue to bring the research and lessons learned from other districts to the board. But I understand where Director Vogel is getting. We need some concrete direction and a timeline, because it takes a while to get 33 more buses. Is that we would need about 33 buses, additional buses? So it takes a while to get those buses ordered and built. And I'm not asking the board tonight for a timeline, but when we come back on the 5th, please give us a timeline.
I think that's where we'll stop at this point, board. I think if there's some of you that feel strongly that you have a clear direction that you would like to propose to board directors in terms of how we move forward, that we will entertain that at our next board meeting. But at this time, let's take a break and be back at 8:45. back in, I think it was January of 2018, that we actually commissioned a task force to begin exploring some of the issues around how we are serving our students with special needs. And I just first of all want to preface this by saying we have been very impressed with the work. I want to also just acknowledge Director Chancho Shore, who has served as the liaison for that task force, staff and parents who have been there from the beginning to work through all the different things that we wanted to have explored that you have done. And so I first of all, I want to just acknowledge all of you for that. With that, I believe Nancy Ingalls is here to introduce our task force, and again, our task force of parents, and then we will look forward to your presentation. Welcome, good evening, and thank you for sticking around this late.
Thank you very much, directors, for this opportunity to talk about the outcomes of the Special Education Task Force. I want to introduce some guests that we have with us tonight, and we had planned to have additional folks join us, but with the day change with the snow day, it was difficult with people's schedules, so we apologize for that. We have Miss Gina Grimes. She's an assistant principal from Saddle Ranch Elementary, and she attended almost all of the task force meetings and actively participated. We have Mr. Chester Shaw. He's a parent in Parker who attended task force meetings and offered to help us with the presentation today. And then we have our two special education directors, Lynette Steinhoff and Sarah Cannon, and of course, Mr. Matt Reynolds, who worked with us very closely. So thank you.
Could you also just, I know they were thrown off because of our postponement of the meeting, but could you also share those parents that assisted you with developing this report?
Absolutely. Our last task force meeting was December 12th. During that meeting, we had Hanover Research join us, and they went through in great detail all of the results of that survey. At that time, we asked participants who would be willing to work with us in a smaller group to plan tonight's presentation. So those who helped us in that planning were Liz Wagner, who's a parent, Lisa Thompson, who also is a parent, Mr. Shaw was there. We also had Melody Fields, who is a parent. And then we had Tricia Zablin, who's a parent and also is on the board for our Douglas County Special Education Advisory Committee.
Very good. Well, hopefully, if they're
Is that everybody?
I wanted to say thank you to all of them, so thank you for acknowledging them as well.
Thank you. Well, before we begin the presentation, I just kind of wanted to review some of the basics of the task force, the work of the task force. A year ago this month, you all passed a resolution to convene the task force to design and administer a survey about special education services to parents and staff in the district. And so we did that. The task force came together and met 6 times over the last year. In those meetings, they participated in structured feedback sessions. And from those feedback sessions and conversations, survey items were developed and prioritized. We then engaged with Hanover Research to develop the survey instrument, administer the survey, and analyze the results. The survey was open for 3 weeks earlier this fall and closed on September 13th. And we had 5,894 survey responses. 77% of those were parents, and 23% of those were staff. So I want to point out that on tonight's agenda, there are 2 documents linked. One is the presentation that we will go through that our task force participants helped us to put together. But the other is the Hanover report that gives a very detailed analysis of the survey results. And I just want to point this out because anybody who wants to really look at any piece of information from the survey results, I encourage them to go to the Hanover report and not necessarily our presentation. I've copied and pasted some of the graphs from the report into the presentation, but it might not give the full story. Hanover begins with an explanation of their survey methodology. Right away, they give their recommendations that are based on the statistical analysis of the survey results. And throughout, they give key findings from the survey results from each of the 9 sections of the survey. I'm just going to scroll here to a couple of different sections. One thing to note in the Hanover report is that they use some color coding that really helps with the volume of information that we see in the report. So they use some coloring to indicate positive responses and negative responses. So when you see a blue color, those typically are the more positive end of responses. And when you see a red color, those are the more negative end of the responses. There were a few areas in the survey where respondents could give a comment. So we call those open-ended responses. And those also were statistically analyzed, and themes were pulled out of those open-ended comments. And you can see those themes on 4 specific pages. Those are pages 12, 16, 39, and 51. And then other things in the report, there are some fine print on some of the pages that give more information about the end size for that particular question, or any other pieces of data that Hanover wants to point out. And so now we'll go ahead and move to the slide deck. I almost thought I was going to have to do some intermission entertainment. That's right. Well, first and foremost, I want to thank everybody who participated in any of the task force meetings. It was a wonderful effort to see how many people gave up their time in the evenings to come to these meetings and participate. So anybody and everybody who participated deserves a lot of credit. I want to open with the value that's been added from the Special Education Task Force. In some of the earlier meetings where we had lots and lots of participation, we had a lot of staff members attend, and we had a lot of parents attend, and we had some community members who attended. We did feedback forms for each of these meetings, and a lot of that feedback was telling us that the opportunity for staff and parents to engage in those conversations together was very meaningful for them, and they very much appreciated it. Of course, the resolution was about developing and administering the survey, and so that truly was developed and born out of that work in the meetings. The survey results that we have in the Hanover report provides staff at all levels with data that can be used for planning, continuous improvement, and family engagement. And then from this work and from the survey data, we'll talk a little bit more at the end in next steps, but this has given us a springboard for ongoing focus groups that we want to engage in to really get into some dialogue and conversations about specific topics and specific program areas. I'm not going to read this slide. It is a copy and paste from page 6 of the Hanover report, which is the recommendations based on the analysis of the survey data. So Hanover recommends that we consider adding resources to special education, that we engage in communication outreach to parents and staff, and that we engage in professional development efforts focused on social emotional learning. The timing of getting these survey results back is actually ideal. We're actively engaging right now in determining action plans for implementing all of those recommendations. Moving on to some of the themes that we see in the survey results. This is where we engaged in dialogue with the task force participants, both in the December meeting and then again earlier in January with this smaller group that we talked about. The task force participants want to be sure that we, as a school district and as individual schools, are really looking at areas where satisfaction rates might be lower in one area versus others. People noted throughout to pay attention to the differences in the staff ratings versus parent ratings. You can see throughout that there are some differences. Early on in the key findings, it talks about some satisfaction rates, being overall 2/3 of parent and staff respondents are satisfied with special education programs, have confidence in their staff's ability to meet student needs, and report that their child or student is making progress. And in reviewing this and talking about this, staff and parents agree that satisfaction rates of 2/3 is an area where we really want to grow and take a look at. We're not satisfied with 2/3. So in the smaller meeting in January, these task force participants really went through the Hanover report, and we talked about, okay, for the board presentation, we don't want to go through the entire Hanover report, but what pieces of that do you want to rise to the surface to have our Board of Education really pay attention to? And as we talked about it, they decided that they wanted to put their high priority items into 5 different categories. And those are training, staffing, funding, communication, and mental health and behavior. So we'll go through each one of those now. So for training, task force members wanted to make sure, again, that we're paying attention to our data, and they would like to see an increase in access to training specific to what staff need. So in the survey, there were some questions about staff prioritizing what their professional development needs are, and we should have training that's differentiated to meet all those needs. Training should be available for topics that frequently come up as questions or concerns. So at the school level or at the district level, if we continue to hear certain areas of concern, we have to match our training opportunities to those areas. Parents are very interested in training for themselves. They talk about how beneficial it would be if they had some parent education about the special education process, the evaluation process, how it can benefit their child, and what resources they have access to at their school. We've talked a lot about the need that our general education teachers have for training about various special education topics. And we have many parents who are very interested in contributing to staff learning and knowledge about their children. So they wanted to highlight page 25, where parents and staff were asked about their familiarity with different special education services available. Some of these percentages are very low, so across the board, there might not be a heightened awareness of what special education programs are available. Page 48 is where staff were able to indicate what their highest training needs are, and those are listed here. And then moving on to staffing. Under the staffing category, the task force participants talked about how important it is that we pay attention to the data we see in the survey around the need for collaboration and planning among staff. It's important to look at the perceptions of staffing levels overall in the survey data, both from parents and from staff. The task force, members of the task force, some of them are very interested in looking at inclusion practices in our schools and want us to make sure that we're considering how staffing levels impact our inclusion practices, and also the timely identification of students eligible for special education. And then just to point out, our staff survey responses were not only special education staff. 45% of them were not special education staff. They were either general education or in a category that just said other. On page 26, again, the task force participants wanted to make sure that we're looking at our staff responses here, again, with the familiarity of programs available. Here's the question about perceptions of how programs are staffed. And then this was an interesting staff question about the greatest challenges they have encountered when working with students eligible for special education. This could potentially correspond with many different areas. It could correspond with resources. It could correspond with staffing levels. All right, moving over to funding. We did talk about in our smaller group that funding really sort of overlaps into all of these other areas, but they still wanted to call it out as a separate category because it's a priority. And we know that Hanover's first recommendation is to consider adding funding to special education programs. Many of the respondents felt that programs are under-resourced, and this survey offered respondents an opportunity to identify what, if we had new funding, what the higher priority spending items could be. This is the question about perceptions of how programs are resourced. And this is the question about prioritizing spending. All right, the next area is communication, and this is a really big one. This survey itself, I just want to point out, is a wonderful piece of communication for us. This is feedback that's going to be very useful in many regards. We all agree that increased awareness and information available about special education programs is very important for our community, both in the district and among parents. We all agree that we would like to increase the amount of information we're sharing with parents about the special education process, especially prior to that initial evaluation. There are parents that very much want everyone to know that they're interested in building collaborative relationships with their school teams so that they can work together. The survey told us that most parents prefer communication via email, and we do know that there are a smaller number of parents who want to continue in these face-to-face interactions, which we will be continuing through focus groups into the future. But that written communication and that increased awareness is also going to be very important, so we'll be doing that concurrently. And then one very important piece is that we have to remember parents want ongoing feedback and communication about their child's progress and about the special education programs and services that they're delivering. Also, just to note that our Douglas County Special Education Advisory Committee is very interested in partnering with us to help many of these communication efforts. So the task force wanted to point out slide 37. In particular, parent responses regarding student placement options. I don't know if I have a. So that's about in the middle here. It's just one thing that they wanted to point out. Page 30 talks about satisfaction with the school's resources and supports that are available. And we wanted to note that improved communication can really impact this particular area. The same with the data on page 32. And then the last area that the task force really wanted to note was around mental health and behavior. When you go through the Hanover report, you can see that needs for professional development and support for students around social emotional learning is a high priority throughout. We know that our principals are beginning to work on implementation of school-wide social emotional learning structures, and that also is perfect timing because all of these things are happening right now, which is great. And then before we get to next steps, I wanted to give Mr. Shaw an opportunity to come up and maybe just say a few words from a parent's voice.
Very good. Mr. Shaw.
Good evening, directors, district staff. Thank you guys for this opportunity to be here. Also, thank you for putting this together, starting this initiative. It's always good from a parent perspective to know that things that we are concerned with hasn't fallen on deaf ears. To start, what I want to say is we're in this together. And if I could sum up these 5 areas that we just talked about with 2 things, one would be communication and one would be collaboration. At Pine Lane Elementary, where my son goes to school, he's on the autism spectrum, they do this thing called crew, where we're all part of this crew. We're all in this together. We're all headed the same place. And that's what we are here for tonight. We're all headed the same place. So speaking from a parent's perspective, we are very much interested in partnering with you guys to let you know that we're here to help as much as we can with communication and collaboration, with whatever it is you need from us to say, do, be a part of, to share our concerns, to know that you guys are listening, that you hear what we're talking about, that when I tuck my son in at night and I plan for his next day, that I know that, hey, this district has his best interests at heart. And not only his, but the other 68,000 that are here. And this is a step in that direction for that. So my big ask is that you keep the Special Education Task Force in play as one of our next steps, that you use us to help with whatever it is, resources, input, whatever needs be, and that you keep in mind that we are in this together through the communication and collaboration that we can put forth and make this thing work. Right? Thank you so much. So I'd say I'm starting to get a little emotional now as I talk about this because it's dear to my heart.
But I think you captured it well, Mr. Shaw. Thank you so much for your tireless efforts of serving on that task force. Thank you.
You know, I'll just add to his statement about keeping the task force going. I think that one of the takeaways that I have from working with this group is that they want to make sure that so we've raised some awareness, we've elicited this feedback, and they don't want it to be sort of put in a drawer and filed away. They want to make sure that there's some systemic accountability for listening to feedback and just continuing that work and engaging with our community and having that inform our continuous improvement efforts. And so I know that that our schools are interested in that, our special education team administratively is interested in that, and Dr. Tucker and I are very committed to that as well. So in terms of next steps, in the December task force meeting, as we were going through the full Hanover report in detail, Some of the task force members asked for some further disaggregation of some of the specific survey results. I think most specifically they had to do with some of those satisfaction areas. And so Hanover's been working on that. Our Hanover report is posted on our district website. There is if you go to S, there's a page, Special Education Task Force. The Hanover report is posted there. There's also an Excel document posted there that gives the raw percentages of every single survey item. And if you go across the tabs at the bottom, it's even separated by school. And so when Hanover delivers the further disaggregation and some of the answers to the questions from that meeting, they're going to add that information to that Excel spreadsheet, and it will be on the public website. We talked about ongoing special education focus groups. Our special education directors are planning to have regular engagement with very specific, and not only the directors, they're going to pull other people into those conversations, but to have very specific ongoing small group meetings that are more targeted to specific areas that people are interested in. So, for example, they may be specific programming areas like SSN or affective needs, or it might be a service like transportation. And so they are working on getting those things started, and they will be ongoing. All of this feedback, both from the survey, the 6 meetings we've had in the last year, and the ongoing focus groups, will inform our district and department strategic plans. And all of this will be aligned with the Board of Education end statements. Like I said before, we're actively working on action plans to implement all of the Hanover recommendations. We also want to work internally and with our Special Education Advisory Committee to provide some ongoing parent engagement activities that are not the focus groups, but these are opportunities that are going to provide more information and maybe some parent education for our community. And then finally, we know that we'll be working with individual schools to examine their own data set and work with them on how their specific feedback can inform their practice. And then finally, I'm just reiterating the Special Education Administration's priorities that were aligned with board ends that they've had in place up to this point. And we know that the feedback from the task force and the survey will continue to inform this as it gets refined. And as the strategic plan becomes developed, that will also refine some of their priorities. So that's all I have. Any questions?
First of all, thank you. And again, thanks to the panel. I know Mrs. Grimes is hiding back there as well, extraordinary educator that I hired, I will just brag, 20-some years ago. But I'm sorry, okay, all right. I wonder though, Mrs. Grimes, from an educator perspective, any other additional comments that weren't necessarily represented in the slides we just saw?
You know, I think the overall themes were the keys. Some of the things that I think we can, and excuse the voice, some of the things we can dig deeper in, if we go back a slide. Yep. One of the ones was around working with our staffs and really having them analyze their own data set. I took our special education team just at one of our meetings through, I facilitated the conversation around the general data, and it really sparked some good conversation. And one of their key questions was, can we get our data? And at that time, I didn't know Hanover was doing that, but so that will be helpful going forward. In the communication realm, I think one of the things we came up with at our team was around that we need to be more specific with parents about what we're doing with the kids, not just going through the IEP and getting to the service delivery amount of time, but then based on the goals and objectives, what matches, what is the resource we're going to use, because then that gives the parents the opportunity to really, to really dig in if they want to do some research online and learn more about Wilson Reading Program or learn about Read Naturally, whatever that specific tool is being used, I think is going to open up some doors with parents.
That's great. I love the summary of how an individual school might use this data, and that is Hanover data can be aggregated to the school, so the schools can actually own their own data and really dig in, just like Mrs. Grimes has been describing. So that's work's already been done. That's very exciting to hear.
You know, one other note that I want to talk about, one of the things we discovered too, the majority, if you look at the numbers, the majority of respondents were high school or middle school, so secondary level. So it would probably benefit elementary schools to figure out a way to dig deeper on our, like we only had maybe 2 respondents, I think. So getting more feedback at a school level in the elementary schools would be helpful.
So this might trigger individual schools digging deeper with their community.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions for the team? Director Lemieux.
Thank you. Thank you. I would also like to recognize Director Ray and Director Chancho Shore for your dedication of time and your heart that you guys have put into this as well. So this is top down, bottom up, and everybody in between that we're supporting this. And so I did want to recognize your volunteer time on that as well. So thank you. And your expertise. We are unbelievably blessed in this district with a myriad of experts everywhere. So my question is, I'm action focused. Obviously, people want action taken on everything that we've done here. And it speaks to financial well-being, the continue a zero-based budgeting item, and this might be actually more for Dr. Tucker. I went back and looked at our personalized learning department, and they are in charge of health, wellness, and prevention, gifted and talented programming, English language development, literacy intervention, early childhood education, special education, which is clearly could be its own department, multi-tiered system of supports, and titles and grants. And if we're going to do zero-based budgeting and they have to meet every single one of those needs, which in my opinion touches 68,000 students, what are we doing to give them the resources that they need? And should we consider this as we're budgeting moving forward? Is this the best use at this level? Because we need to think higher up. We'll let them do the job of in the weeds, but what can we do to help them get the resources that they need?
Dr. Tucker.
Yes, we certainly appreciate that challenging question. It's so challenging. I'm going to ask Mr. Smith and Ms. Ingalls to speak about this. One, we need to look at how we're utilizing time and resources. There's no doubt, as I've been saying for the last 7 months, we simply, per capita, just simply don't have the number of staff. I mean, we're extremely, extremely lean administratively, but our folks continue to do an outstanding job. But we also are looking at how we can perhaps reorganize. I know Nancy and Marlena spent time planning in terms of how we can perhaps shift some areas, some departments over to our Chief Academic Officer. She's back here, and I know that you had a couple of conversations. And Nancy, you want to talk a little bit about that, and then we'll ask Scott to talk about the financial implications.
In terms of structure, I don't believe we're at a position that we can talk about it in detail yet, but the idea with a new curriculum department, just sort of looking at our system to really examine, are there certain areas that that need to work more closely with curriculum. It was the nature of our conversation. So we don't have any specific plans at this time. But again, our strategic planning is going to very much inform some of that structure. I'll say that from my experience, our finance department and our cabinet has always been very supportive in the budgeting season when I bring forth the multitude of department-based budgets that I have that really have been designed to meet all of the needs that those particular teams see in our system. We work very closely with the budget office to do our SBB allocations for gifted English language development teachers and special education. And so I do feel that the district has been very supportive when we have expressed needs, in particular when it means increasing funding. Our number of students on IEPs continues to grow every year, and the funding does grow with it. Also, there are times that we have needed to add additional special programs for specific needs. Affective needs in particular, we have added several programs over the last 3 years to meet the needs in our system, and that has always been supported. Our bridge program has grown over the years. That has always been supported. And so I don't know if Mr. Smith wants to talk a little bit more about funding.
We'll ask him to talk about funding,
Okay.
but to directly address Director Lemieux's question, we will go beyond the communication between our CIPG, our Chief Academic Office, and special ed and other departments under your supervision, Nancy. We will look at reorganization. That's no ifs and buts about it. Strategic planning is a big part of that. We want to see what conversations emerge organically from our strategic planning that it's going to run perhaps for the next 6 or 7 months. So point well taken. We do a great job with the people we have, but reorganization certainly will be coming. And Scott, you want to talk a little bit about finances?
Thank you for the question. As Nancy alluded to, the budget impact in her area is single-handedly the largest spend we have in the district. I think their department is one that has benefited from moving to a zero-based budgeting process instead of rolling over, because we've truly gone to their department and say, what do you need? If you look at the contingency requests that come in, we've already pushed out over $1 million mid-year to the departments and the schools that are funded through the departments that Mrs. Ingalls runs and supports. It is, like I said, it's one of the largest spends we have. We know it's a moral imperative as well as a financial imperative to fund those needs. And I believe, as Mrs. Ingalls mentioned, we have a great partnership and collaboration there. I think the cabinet is credibly supportive. And I think one thing I want the community to know is that when you see our budget presentations, and one of the first things out of the gate is increased funding for special education or increased funding for ESL, those types of things, is that is actually bearing to fruition. If you look at maintenance of effort, which is how you quantify how much you're spending on special education, in 5 years, our district has gone from $55 million to almost $81 million in 5 years on an annual basis in spend. We are investing in special education and the personalized learning department, and quite heavily, to be honest. I think it's the right thing to do for the school district, but it is a massive undertaking and one that we take seriously and try to partner with to make sure those needs, given our funding realities. Obviously, we're very thankful with 5A passing. That gives us more flexibility around funding with special education, but the way the state funds special education, the way the federal government funds special education, local districts are largely responsible for meeting all of the unfunded mandates and again, moral imperative that we have to meet those needs. And I think we've done a really, really good job with it. And I know from the finance perspective, we value their partnership because we know when they come and ask us for something, they truly need it. And we're very happy to respond and provide that flexibility to make sure that they can respond to those needs as they arise.
Good. Other questions? Director Vogel.
I think this is going to be a survey question again, Mr. Reynolds.
He's slow to get
I
up.
know, he's like, what are you doing? One of the things that kind of struck me was that Hanover made a recommendation, because I thought, well, are they special education experts, and why is it that they're making a recommendation? But then I remembered in our late start time survey, they made a recommendation there as well. So is this a typical thing for a survey company to provide a recommendation based on the data that they receive?
Yes, so they're making a recommendation based on what they see within the data. It's not an overall recommendation for programming. They're just making a recommendation based on what they see within the data and the responses of the survey. So that's what their recommendation is based on. They're saying, based on how people respond to this question, we recommend you do this. And they're simply responding to the survey itself.
Okay. And then to follow up on that, Mr. Shaw, from a parent's perspective, as a member of the task force, was the task force satisfied with what that recommendation was from Hanover?
I think so. Okay. It was a kind of a task to drill down to those 5 areas because we got in the weeds a lot, but I think that we pretty much were on task with what they recommended and gung-ho.
Okay, perfect, thank you. And then my very last question is, I know we...
Can I add to that?
Yeah, please.
I was just going to say with the three recommendations, the three key recommendations, I think we find so many connections to everything we're doing. I was even thinking back to Director Holtzman's comment earlier with the previous task force that was working on things and how do we help that mental health, and it connects back to the counselors you're providing, the things that are happening in early elementary school, that early intervention, and then we're talking about, you know, continuing to add the funding to special education. It impacts all kids, not just students who are identified as special education. So I think that's key, and with the task force recommendations from Hanover, those themes are themes that we're seeing throughout our entire district as needs, not just for this task.
Okay, thank you. And then I have one more.
Mr. Shaw, you were going to ask him a question, or did you?
No, he did it.
Okay.
He answered.
Okay, sorry.
Last question is...
Good to see you again, Mr. Director Vogel, please.
I know that we always want more information because the more better and more accurate it's going to be. Are we satisfied with the results that we got in terms of it being an accurate amount for us to get the right kind of information we need moving forward?
I think that the survey was very extensive, and the data that we got back from the survey is very, very helpful. Is it enough? I'm not sure if you mean the number of responses that we got or the types of questions that we had, but I think that since it was organically developed from the task force, that the topic areas and the questions are very authentic to our current state. And so I am very grateful to have this data. I know our schools are grateful to have it. We've had many schools ask questions about how they can use it. It really helps our special education administration team. Throughout that data, there are areas all over the place that we can, use that data to really drill down and help schools engage with their community.
I just want to capture one thing that Director Vogel said, just to make sure I'm understanding, is that we're not necessarily going directly to action plans from the Hanover recommendations, but we're interweaving that with the filter of the conversation that our task force members had. So I guess my question is, we're not just strictly saying, well, the survey said, so therefore action plans. We really had engagement with people like Mr. Shaw and our parents to say, personalize the data now. You know, really make it so it's meaningful to who Douglas County is, as opposed to saying survey, here's the action plan. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, we're doing both because we don't want to bypass the Hanover recommendations because they come from the survey data. We did the survey for a reason, to get this feedback. So I do think it is important to work on implementation of those recommendations and continue to do the work. It's like I said, it's given us the springboard to do the other work that you just described, and not just for a quarter or a semester or for a year, but to really have that become our process moving forward.
Thank you. Director Chancha-Shore and then Director Holtzman.
I really don't have any more questions, but I do have comments. So going into this a year ago, I'm not a very easy sell when it comes to anything that has to do with educational practice and individualized education of our students. And coming into it and trying to hear the needs from the parents and hear at the beginning a year ago and hear the conversations that occurred, and then watching you guys and facilitating and trying not to be an evaluative person at the same time, but facilitating progress, I have to say I am completely impressed with where you came to, from where we were in conversations and understandings and the development of where our programs were and what our needs were to where we are now. You may have had those understandings, but not all of us had the same, we came to the same ends, which really was facilitated by the work of the staff and the parents that were involved. So I am honored to have been a part of that, and I just have to say, I feel relieved after this whole year process that we are definitely, as a school system, on the track of making sure that we're listening and communicating and meeting the needs of the students in our community. And I just have to thank you from the bottom of my heart for the work that you did. And when I say thank you, I'm talking to the people who participated on the task force, but I am also talking to the people in this room. You guys gave so much time and energy being in a school district and working in a school system. I don't think the majority of people in our country understand that it's a 12 to 15 hour a day job every day. And that doesn't include what we're asking you to do. That includes everything else. And then when the board comes and asks for these other pieces, your day goes from 15 hours to 18 hours. And really that is what you did. And I just want to thank you for taking this on in the way that you did with so much professionalism and enthusiasm. And sometimes it was super hard, and you maintained professionalism throughout the process. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Holtzman.
So thank you, guys. I want you to know I'm very grateful for what you've done, and it's so encouraging to hear Director Chancho Shore talk to us about it, just the overall process. I'm very thankful to you guys, and I'm excited about the progress we're making, and I still have to ask a few questions because I know that people are going to ask me, and this is what I do. So I'm grateful, but I've got a few tough questions. I guess the first one is more of just a survey question, and you explained it a little bit, and I think it's explained in the Hanover survey, but it looks like there was like over 1,000 respondents that were not counted. And I know that that I sent some folks, like about a year ago, I was getting a lot of communication from folks about special education, and I was saying, we have a survey, and you were so gracious to connect with them and talk with a lot of those folks. And so my understanding was that they were going to be able to participate in the survey, and that's what I told people. And I knew at the time that some of those were recent graduates of our high schools, some of those were parents of students who had just graduated or had left our district. So I'm feeling like I hope that we captured their comments, and I hope that those aren't the folks whose surveys got disqualified. So if you could just talk to me a little bit about that.
Sure. So there's a little over 1,000 who were in this disqualified category based on how they responded. So the survey was one of those where they did their own kind of create your own adventure. So how you answered the survey kind of led you down a pathway for where your next set of questions were. So staff had a certain set of questions, and you had parents had a certain set of questions. So one of the questions asked them, were you a parent of a student or a staff member last year? So the goal was to capture the service from last year. So if they self-selected that they didn't have a student, or if they weren't a staff member, it disqualified them from answering the rest of the questions based on the email addresses. Now that was around a little over 200-ish of the 1,000 were in that category. And that could be for a myriad of reasons. We're polling email addresses from last year, so some of those email addresses that we polled may not be applicable, or the person just self-selected those responses. So that was one category. They're not staff or parents, is what they eliminated themselves from. Another question asked them specifically regarding service. It asked them the question, has your child been receiving service currently, in the past, or have been evaluated for service for special education? And they're self-selecting themselves as to not being part of any of those categories. So therefore, the questions involving what kind of service you've gotten, they can't answer them because they've never been involved in either currently getting service from last year, have gotten service in the past in the case of somebody who's graduated or has been evaluated for special education service. Now, part of the feedback that we've got throughout the whole process, one of my goals throughout this whole process, and we've had extensive conversation about it, is I was kind of the stick in the mud when it came to honoring the resolution, where I wanted to ensure that no matter what the Special Education Task Force wanted to do, you all put out a resolution that we were going down this pathway to make sure that we ask specific questions about special education service for parents and staff. So that was one of my pushes throughout the whole process. Now, we got feedback, as you're hearing, that we wanted to encompass more than just parents that were getting service or have had service in the past. So one of the things that we did is we opened up an open source resource online to gather feedback from people, and it was posted up on the website for those that felt like they needed to give us more information outside the parameters of the survey. I don't know if that's something that you want to touch on.
Yes, so we did have a few responses there, and there were some that we followed up individually, and others that we noted the information. And if you had connected me with somebody, which I really do appreciate, if I've had email correspondence or a meeting with somebody, all of that information is sort of included in this overall thinking about moving forward, absolutely. Similarly, if we had parents who maybe were only able to attend, let's say, just one task force meeting, but I had an individual meeting with them outside, again, those conversations and that feedback is also included in all of this. Not in the Hanover report, but in our...
Director Chandrashores, and I want Director Holzman to have a follow-up, but just to clarify on the 1,000 that were disqualified, if it was a parent in our system but did not have a child receiving special services, would they have had other questions to respond to?
Yes, so when Matt talks about choose your own adventure, there's a series of questions. If the parent said, yes, I'm a parent, no, my student is not eligible, and there's an additional question about, has your student ever been evaluated? Do you have any feedback about the evaluation process? The disqualifications, the 700 and some, indicated they chose none of the above. And so when they chose none of the above, that's when their survey stopped.
So both things had to be true. They weren't a parent, and their child wasn't being served by special needs.
No, that's not true. They could be a parent.
Okay.
And if they chose my student, the options were my student is receiving services. Okay. My student has received services in the past. My student has been evaluated, or none of the above. If they selected none of the above, then the survey stopped for them.
Is that Director Holtzman and then Director Chandrashore?
So just a quick follow-up, and then I just have a couple more. So is it possible to deny a parent an evaluation? I go to a school and the school says you're not appropriate for an evaluation. Is that possible?
And the school says what?
Your child is not a candidate for an evaluation. Is that something that they could tell them?
I'm going to let our special education directors answer that.
Good evening. If a school chooses to not evaluate a student, they must follow a procedural process called a prior written notice with the explanation of why. We require that require special education district to review the data to make sure that that is a defensible decision. There are times where there are students that where families request evaluation and the district chooses not to evaluate because there is no data after an extensive review of body of evidence that would indicate that the student may have a disability or that the district suspects the student has a disability.
So let me look at this. So kind of where to go from there. So on page 39 of the Hanover study, it says that one of the themes was, and I can just read it, and I think these themes came from people writing in comments. Some parents report dissatisfaction with the special education evaluation process. Some specifically feel the identification process is in need of improvement. And then on the slide number 5, it seems to me that you're kind of addressing it a little bit with parents. It says that you're thinking of educating parents to be aware of and to be able to access better special education services. I guess my question is, are we also thinking of, based on that theme, I didn't really see questions. I saw accessibility, but I didn't really see that question. And I'm a little bit concerned about the disqualification of people who never went through the identification process, that those were discredited. So kind of what I'm getting at is, and also we've had conversations recently about the fact that our district as a whole serves somewhere a little bit over 10%, I think, of our students are special education students. If you look across the district, not all of our schools serve 10%. Some serve much less than half. And if I'm just wondering, obviously I have no idea if that correlates, but if there is some issue with the identification process, are we also looking at educating staff in all of our schools? No matter how they're governed, all of our public schools. Are we looking at addressing that issue with more than just the parents?
That's one of the things that has been very helpful about the survey data was we had started making some, we'd been reviewing practices before the survey data became available. And one of the leadership team priorities that they identified was evaluation. And so all of the special education coordinators, we have a coordinator for every feeder, and Alternative Campus has gone out and worked with teams specifically on evaluation processes. We're always looking for room for improvement, and so that is one thing that we've targeted. The leadership team is targeted for this year, and that's ongoing. And then I think recently we have been talking much more with schools about if you're going to deny an evaluation, what does that need to look like? So, and that's in response to the survey data of seeing that there were concerns about timeliness and potentially our processes if we were going to deny evaluation. So that has probably been recent, but definitely this year that has been a focus for the team.
So if an evaluation doesn't happen, can you talk, we don't just leave it at that.
If a parent is expressing a concern about a student, we obviously want to look at that and go, where is that concern, what's happening there? And so that's when you're going to work with the general education staff, school counselors, going through an MTSS process perhaps to help and also drill down to what's the root cause of that concern. Is it executive functioning? Is it not enough sleep because we're working multiple jobs, or a variety of things? And so really working with teams on, it's not okay just to say, no, we do need to figure out, is the student struggling, where are they struggling, and how can we benefit, and how can we help with that?
Last question, and it's really quick. Because I know I'll get emails about this, and I know you're working on the action plans, when about can we expect that you'll be sharing those?
I think that the first step is going to be working with the district strategic plan. So I can't remember the timeline on that, but I know that it's this spring. We know that a district strategic plan is going to be more global, but we want to use that as our infrastructure to fine-tune additional plans in special education. But in addition to that, we're at the very beginning of the budget season, so if there are action items that are budget related, we're going to see that through our budget process.
Okay, so I think strategic planning is going to be at least 6 to 7 months, maybe longer than that. I guess I'm just wanting a little bit better of an idea so that when people who have participated and are, it is moving in the right direction, I'm just wanting an idea, months or a year or...
We have we are actually working right now on looking at dates for the first round of focus groups, where and so we'll be able to communicate that out in the next 10 days. We're actually going to try to look for locations as early as tomorrow. So we will be working with communications and our DC Special Education Advisory Council to advertise those out and working with schools to send information out to parents. So there are things happening right now. And perhaps we can come up with a way to communicate that with the board as we go.
That would be great. The more communication about kind of what's going on, that would be awesome. And not just with the board, but just the community, because you guys are doing great work. So thanks.
Very good. Twitter Chandrashore.
Well, you just raised my blood pressure a minute ago because I thought I heard you say, and I want a point of clarification, that you do deny parents an evaluation if they request. Did I hear that correctly?
If there would be absolutely no body of evidence that would indicate a need, that a concern that there's a suspected disability, the school district is able, if they issue prior written notice, to deny an evaluation.
Huh. So I'll follow up on that.
It doesn't happen very often. But
Yeah, I'll follow up on that question with you, because that is a question that I'm not going to just kind of lay on the table as the answer that I want to hear. But also, I'd like to assure that in every case, when our parents are requesting, they have an ability for a process. So could you just clarify for a moment that if there isn't a denied an evaluation, that there's a process that they can...
The process is that the process described that's laid out in federal special education law is a prior written notice is sent to the parent, and that prior written notice allows the parent, gives the parent some of the same procedural safeguards that a parent of a student with an identified disability has. They have dispute resolution options available to them as well.
Can I add to that? So like Sarah, first and foremost, this does not happen very often at all. If there is a body of evidence missing to sort of demonstrate that there's a suspicion of a disability, then the school team will work to develop that body of evidence, to collect more data, do some more investigation that might not be yet formal special education testing, but there are lots of other layers of assessment and collection of data, observations that still can be done and should be done to drill down a little bit more on what the concern is. I want to make sure that you know that it's not just a denial and that's it, but gathering more information. Yes. Yes, yes.
All right, Director Vogel.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. I think it's going to be for Directors Chuncho, Shore, and Ray, and possibly Dr. Tucker. I had a concern that was brought to my attention that we have not followed the resolution that was done to create the task force and everything. I read it. It seems to me that we've followed everything in the resolution. Are you guys satisfied, board members that have been involved, and Dr. Tucker, that we have addressed everything in the resolution and been thorough and completed?
Matt held us to that resolution at every meeting and every planning meeting, and continued to tell us and remind us of the specifics of the resolution to keep us on track. I personally felt like we met the needs of the resolution.
And I would just say, as the author of the resolution, I would just say I am satisfied. I think you've nailed it in terms of the categories. I think when you look at training, staffing, funding, communication, mental health behavior, that nails exactly what we need to be paying attention to. That's got to be on our dashboard. And I think, I appreciate the honesty too, Nancy, from your team to say, you know what, we're not there yet. We appreciate this data because it really gives us some affirmation of where we need to dig in deeper, and I don't think you're certainly presenting to us that, gosh, everything's perfect, by no means. We love the data, it's informing our next steps, and I think you've nailed it. So I would say, yes, I feel like the resolution has been satisfied, and I can't thank you and Matt enough. And Matt, thank you for the non-negotiable of the resolution. I appreciate that as well. So.
And I just want to say again, on behalf of the task force, that I think that their desire and maybe their fear is that the awareness and the accountability might fade over time. And so I know that the board will hold Dr. Tucker accountable, who will hold me accountable, who will hold them accountable, and schools for continuing to engage in this connection that we've created with the community.
Well, and I would say I like what Mr. Shaw said in terms of not only we're in it together, and we have to communicate and collaborate, but I think you also, Mr. Shaw, recommended that we keep this group somehow intact. And I would suggest that this is now a staff task force. Quite honestly, I think the board has charged you and you followed the direction that we had hoped. But I absolutely agree. I think we have to have that parent group continue to serve in that accountability role. To do, as Director Holtzman's wondering, is do we have action plans in place? And does that parent group agree that those action steps are going to do what we intend for them to do based on the data you collected? So I don't know how the board feels, but I don't know that we need to continue a board task force, but I would certainly endorse and support the recommendation that staff continue to have this kind of engagement with our parents. Just a thought. Director Lung?
So let me answer these questions. Is this survey breakdown between charter school and non-charter school? You know that there's always a misconceptions or out there that the service in the special need provided by charter school is not sufficient. So I just wonder whether when you do this, you have that breakdown.
Yes, we do have responses from charter schools, and in the Excel document that is posted on the district website on the Special Education Task Force page, there are tabs along the bottom that I think one of them says by school. You can specifically look at charter schools on that tab and look at their survey responses.
So is there any conclusions you can draw from the survey?
For charters?
Yes.
So the Hanover report doesn't call out specific schools. And it's been some time since I looked at that individual school data. It's pretty massive, that spreadsheet is. But we will be working with all of our leaders, both neighborhood schools and charter leaders, to examine their own data and work with their communities on that.
The reason I'm asking that question is because, again, there is this kind of divide in this community. Intentionally, not intentionally, by somebody who's trying to drive, a reach between neighborhood school and charter school. So I just want to make sure that we accurately reflect the fact about special educations for all type of school, so that when we implement a policy later from the founding, we could make sure that all Dallas County students are treated adequately?
Yes, absolutely. And just to make sure you're aware also, our special education coordinators who work with our neighborhood schools on a regular basis with their teams also work with the charter schools in their feeder. And so they have regular interaction, they have access to training. And so we have some firsthand knowledge about what's happening in those schools through that work with the coordinators. When my recollection in looking through the survey data by school, I don't remember anything jumping out from any charter school that was overly concerning or different than neighborhood schools, other than maybe some of them had very small response rates, but some of our neighborhood schools also had very small response rates.
Very good. All right, again, huge applause, celebration. There's not many of us in the room, but I think we need to applaud you guys for the work you've done. Job well done, and I certainly, I believe the board is in agreement that your next steps are right on target, and we're looking forward to the action plans, as Director Holtzman will hold you to it otherwise. So, so yeah. All right.
Thank you
Very good.
so much.
Thanks again. Have a good evening. Next on our agenda is a follow-up to our mill levy override. Mr. Smith is going to walk us through some updates where we are currently with that additional funding. And again, we are grateful to our community for providing this for us. Mr. Smith.
Sorry, I don't have it memorized. All right. Good evening again. I just want to provide some additional information about the mill levy override associated with 5A. Again, as Director Ray said, we're incredibly thankful and appreciative to our voters for entrusting us with these funds, and we are going to invest them exactly as how we had committed to them back in the fall. One thing I do want to talk about to start with is property taxes and school districts. So our fiscal year does not align with the calendar year, which is also the tax year. So what this means is that taxes collected in the spring fund the entire school year. So if you recall, oftentimes when I'm here giving quarterly reports, I'll point out in the first and second quarter, hey, we haven't gotten any property taxes yet, but they're coming, and they fund the entire school year. And really why this is important is that this is not a choice we in Douglas County make. This is not a choice that school districts across the state of Colorado make. Everyone has the same issue. The Governmental Accounting Standards Board actually dictates how we record property taxes. And they say that any taxes levied during a fiscal year are recorded at the beginning of that fiscal year. So when we bring our proposed tax rates to the board in December and the board certifies those tax rates, based on accounting standards, those are recorded for the entire fiscal year, even though they're levied halfway through, and most of the collections happen in the third quarter and the fourth quarter of that fiscal year. So this is our ballot language from 5A, and understanding that there is a disconnect between our fiscal year and the calendar or tax year, the ballot language said commencing in collection year 2019, which is exactly where we are at right now. And this is what our voters approved, and this is what we are doing. So what does this mean for the 18-19 budget? We will collect the entire $40 million in this fiscal year because, again, going back to the accounting standards, anything that is levied in this fiscal year is booked to this fiscal year. The budget that was brought to all of you in June for our fiscal year that begins July 1 didn't contemplate any new revenue from 5A or 5B. In fact, we didn't even know if we were going to be on the ballot. So we are not going to plan to have funds and start spending funds until we know if they are going to pass. This means that we are going to spend the vast majority of this money in this school year. And the revised budget was on the consent agenda tonight, and there's more money going out to schools, and I'll get into all the detail on pay raises and all those types of things. But we can't spend all of the money this year. And the perfect example is counselors. We are hiring over 80 new counselors thanks to the trust our voters have placed in us to support the mental health needs that we've talked a lot about tonight of our students. It wouldn't have been fiscally responsible to go out and start hiring 80 counselors in July, start paying them, and then hope that the ballot initiative passes. So we need the full $6 million and actually a little bit more that I'm going to talk about in a minute to fund all of these counselors, as we mentioned in the ballot language. But we don't have it right now. So we have one-time uses of funds for this year that support the initiatives in 5A. For instance, we need to go recruit these counselors. We have to go find them. We have to bring them in. We have to hire them. We have to onboard them. We are going to front-load professional development days when they get here so we can get them up to speed and integrated into the system as quickly as we possibly can. We also committed to our secondary schools that changing the ratio from 1 to 350 to 1 to 250, that we'd only fund them full FTE or full-time equivalents because a 6.4 counselor doesn't help as much as 7.0. That is going to cost us a little bit more than $6 million every year. And this money that won't be spent this year, intentionally so, will help us support that initiative over the next number of years, the next decade, as we can slowly draw those funds to support the initiatives that were outlined in 5A. So what this really means is that we will receive the full $40 million. I want to focus on the top and the bottom line. Salary increases are given and they are out, and they were retroactive to the beginning of the school year, and employees will continue to see those pay increases throughout the rest of this year and in perpetuity. And then at the bottom, our charter schools, we allocated their full 100% mill levy override share, also retroactive to the beginning of the school year, because those property taxes fund the entire school year. That is already out in charter schools as well. They get a monthly transfer, so it was retroactively applied to their transfer previously, and now their new monthly transfer reflects the increased amount. The pieces in the middle are where we are intentionally and strategically investing in these resources. I want to be clear. What we don't want to do is have money come in, our voters have entrusted us with us, and hastily spend the money as fast as we can to ensure that we spend every single dollar quickly as fast as we can. We want to invest the money wisely and strategically and purposefully to the initiatives in 5A. It's not going anywhere else. It is going to those initiatives, but we want to make sure that we are good stewards of the taxpayer money. This promotes taxpayer efficiency and fiscal responsibility in that we will spend funds when we have a strategic purpose that we can allocate that money to. So for this year, we are going to spend some money on counselors. We are out recruiting. We are out hiring. Our estimate standing here in January is we think we're going to spend about $1 million in this fiscal year. That could be more if we can accelerate hiring, but that's the process that's going on right now. Our HR team is working really hard to make sure that we can find great employees to come to the Douglas County School District to help us support our mental health initiatives. We're also pushing more money out to schools right now. So the last meeting, we talked a lot about the 1920 budget and the changes to SBB. And if you remember, one of the things that we pushed on was that principals were comfortable making changes now if they would continue into the future. Well, that applies to this year as well. So there's $1 million going out to all of our neighborhood schools, and then the $1.7 million for the weight associated with students who qualify for free reduced lunch. Again, that's not tied to individual students. That is just the proxy we use to try to identify schools with higher at-risk populations, which we know cost more just based on student need and student equity. So that is going out to schools right now as we speak. So what this means, in full transparency, is that we are not going to spend all $40 million this first fiscal year. Again, this money is not going anywhere other than the initiatives associated with 5A. As I mentioned, we have the one-time costs associated with counselors. We are going to be investing money in career and technical education. There's going to be one-time costs to get that off the ground, whether it's new programming, curriculum purchases, whatever it may be. We are going to make sure that the money that our taxpayers entrusted us with is invested wisely and strategically as we move forward. So what does this mean for 1920? I want everyone to be clear in that this is not our proposed budget for 1920. This is a very high-level plan of where we're going. We're in January. The board will get the proposed budget in May. So we are just kicking off the budget development process. We will spend the full $40 million starting in that next fiscal year because, again, I wouldn't have built a budget that contemplated new revenue before we knew we were going to get it. As we look at the different buckets that we've identified, and I've mentioned this before, compensation is out. It's employees' paychecks, and that's going to continue into the future. That's not going to change. Counselors. School budgets were released today. We spent 3 hours at the district leadership team meeting going through SBB and talking about all the changes that we had talked about here, some more detail. There is all the money for school counselors in all of our elementary schools and all of our secondary schools, and they are budgeting to spend that right now so that they can start hiring for next year. Same thing with our school funding. You know, we pushed the money through that we talked about related to all schools, free reduced lunch, small schools to ensure that we have equity within different sizes of schools. But we know that there is money that we are using to invest strategically around equity. And that's where, as Mrs. Ingalls alluded to, we're starting to gather feedback and make strategic decisions about how to invest in places like special education, invest in other areas of our district. But again, that process is just kicking off. So this is not to say that the money associated with school funding just goes into a pure discretionary account at our schools. We're trying to make sure that all of our schools receive more funds, which they are, that we reflect the higher costs of associated with educating higher concentrations of at-risk students, and making sure our small schools have similar resources to our larger schools in terms of programming. But all of that together is about half of the money that is associated with more equitable school funding. We are going to be investing the other half, whether it's through highly impacted, into recommendations from the Special Education Task Force, areas around gifted and talented, and a myriad of other things that we're exploring, getting feedback from school leaders, trying to, again, I know I'm being repetitive here, invest the money strategically and wisely and make sure that we get the best return on our investment for our taxpayers that they have invested with us. And as I mentioned, career and technical education. Those plans are being formulated right now. And that money will either be pushed out through schools or will be managed through the CTE department for programming for schools. It's not going into some black hole in the department, right? This is going to provide additional options for our schools going forward. And then lastly, our charter schools will continue to receive their 100% per pupil share, just as we've always done and will continue into the future. And that's how we will, again, we will provide more detail to the board, to the public as we go through the budget development process. But I would ask for a little bit of grace and patience as literally budget development started today. And so we need to start going through that process, the strategic planning process, making those decisions about where we're going to invest those dollars. And then once those decisions are formulated, begun to be made, just like we've done in the past, that'll be brought to the board, because that, I know I have my narrow view on things, but that's one of the most important things we do as a school district, because your budget is a reflection of your values, and we need to be able to show where we're investing this money and how we're investing this money, and that will come. It will come in the spring. And so this is where we are here in January and how it affects 18-19, and then the plan for 19-20, understanding that we still have decisions to be made and we still have money to allocate, to make sure we allocate it wisely and be good stewards of those funds that our taxpayers have entrusted with us. And I know I said it at the beginning, I'll say it again, I can't personally thank our voters enough, and I know our colleagues here at the district and on the board share that as well, of that this is a huge step in the right direction and will make a big impact for all of the students in Douglas County across all of our schools. So we are incredibly thankful and appreciative. But that is the update for today, and I'd be happy to take any questions that the board may have.
First of all, thank you, Scott. And I mean, I think in the perfect world, the fiscal year and the school year would be in sync. And I think that's what you're projecting here, is that that's not how we do business, unfortunately, with a school year versus a fiscal year. I guess I have a couple questions, and then one of the things I'm wondering about, I know you spoke to special education being in that equitable school funding piece. Is there ways to hold accountable when we pass those dollars on to that student-based budget to say, these dollars need to go towards special education or ESL or whatever students of need that you might have? Is there accountability for that?
Absolutely. So if you think about our site-based budgets, and any of you have sat on SACs or gone through it, the vast majority is discretionary funds, which is what we want, right? Our principals in our communities understand what they need better than us sitting in an office making decisions on their behalf. But the other half of the budget is non-discretionary, in that there is no flexibility. And special education is the biggest example of non-discretionary allocations. So what happens is, as Director Lemieux was pointing out, Mrs. Ingalls has a massive job responsibility. She and her team provide to us, this is how many teachers, educational assistants that this school needs. That's what we put on the budget, and that is what the school buys. They still have flexibility because they are the hiring manager, right? They are still the evaluator, but if Nancy says they need 7 FTE, we give 7 FTE, and the school has to budget 7 FTE. There's no flexibility around things like special education, ESL, reading recovery. Counselors now are non-discretionary as well. So yes, there is no ability to use those dollars for anything other than special education.
My other question is that with charter schools, they're in the same dilemma as all of us, that they won't be able to expend the money that we've passed to them in the 2019 year either. I mean, they're going to need to spend some of that the following year as well because of the same dilemma. Is that correct?
Yeah, most likely. I would say from a district perspective, this is not a Douglas County issue. This is just the way school finance works in Colorado. This is the way that school districts, when they pass an election, it comes mid-year, and you spend most of your money on staffing as it is, so you've got to ramp into that spending. In terms of charter schools, I would anticipate most, if not all of them, have the exact same issue. And the only reason I say that is that if they choose to do something differently, because their mill levy dollars are general fund dollars, if they were waiting for a big capital repair, right, they could go, do something like replace a roof or do something like that. But odds are, without having firsthand knowledge, they're going to do the same thing we are. They're going to make strategic investments this year and then plan how they're going to invest that money going into the future.
Other questions for Mr. Smith regarding the update? Again, I can't thank you enough. I think about the people that have been mostly impacted, and your department, I mean, I just can't even begin to understand the heavy responsibility that your department has had through all this. I mean, it's a nice problem to have, obviously, but I just want, on behalf of the board, just express our sincere gratitude for all the hours your department has put in to make this successful, as well as being very clear that promises made will be promises kept. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Any other? All right. Dr. Tucker.
Director Ray, President Ray, and other directors, please forgive me. I want to jump in here, and my comments are not a reaction to our public speakers, and as you all have charged me to reach out to our public speakers when they have questions and concerns. And I want to say thanks to each one of you for your professionalism and restraint in not giving into conversations regarding personnel matters. And I, again, want to take 2 minutes, that's all, to give some reflections. I received a couple emails today about an employee situation. And my professional response has been, we don't discuss personnel matters. And I know after multiple times of saying this verbally and in writing, it's frustrating, and I get it. And I'm sure you all are frustrated as well. But again, in a minute and a half and a couple of observations, we cannot discuss personnel issues, and I'll reach out to our people today, and if I need to put something in writing to the public, I'll work with Stacy in the communications department to draft that. Our employees should not and will not have their employment records discussed by us, by me, the superintendent, in a public forum. There's state law in place as well as board policy that prohibits that. And I probably should have made these points earlier because we don't want to get ourselves in a situation. These are legal matters. We will get sued, and we have been sued. And one of the promises that I made to the board and to our community ostensibly was the fact that we're going to take those dollars, and we love our attorneys and so forth, but we're going to take those dollars, avoid lawsuits, and spend that money in the classroom where it should be spent. And the last thing I'll say is that we've had quite a few media folks here, and I know Alex is still here with us tonight, and we love our media friends, but sometimes our timelines, and I know the board is itching to get this, any investigation done, but sometimes our timelines simply don't mesh with the timelines of our community and with our friends in the media. We have to be thorough so that we're not spending taxpayers' money defending ourselves.
Agreed. Well, thank you, Dr. Tucker. And I would just say that, I mean, I was going to say some reflections during my president report, but I would just echo that we have a policy that very specifically states it is the Board of Education's policy not to hear in public session personal complaints against any district personnel. And we are driven by policy. We have no choice, and you're absolutely right. Sometimes we have to make tough decisions to protect the district from vulnerability. And I think that's what we did today, and it was very uncomfortable, I will say, because we certainly have always wanted to hear from our public, but as soon as individual names are mentioned, they're making us vulnerable to possible litigation and for defamation, for slander, and so I would agree with your comments that absolutely we take a hard stand. We want to treat people with respect and treat them appropriately and protect everyone from being personally attacked without due process. And so thank you for inserting yourself in those thoughts, and thank you, board, for your patience to let me respond as well. We're going to move on then to Board Policy JICH, Student Involvement Regarding Drugs and Alcohol, is a first reading of a revised policy. And Mrs. Clemish, are there any comments you'd like to make, first of all, regarding this draft? Mrs. Clemish, or is it Mr. Knight? Oh, sorry. Mr. Knight, you can speak as well.
Either one. So JICH, the only change you'll see in this first reading is taking out the mandatory expulsion for drugs and alcohol. So this policy is now congruent with prior board policy changes that now leave basically federal firearm offenses as the only mandatory expulsion. So it's changing drug and alcohol violations from shall expel to may. So our school leaders still have that option, but it does no longer forces them to ask to expel a student for certain drug and alcohol offenses.
Any questions about the draft? And I'm grateful that we're getting aligned and updated. But any other questions regarding this draft? Director Lemieux?
I would just point one thing out. It does say illegal drugs, and this does not include smoking, nicotine. We have a whole separate policy for that. So if anybody's wondering why that's not mentioned in here, it's because that's a different policy. And that would be the only thing I have to say. Thank you.
Mr. Knight, any response to that? Are you in agreement with it? That's the reason tobacco is not mentioned in this policy?
I'll get the acronym wrong, but we are working on further revisions to some of these policies of drugs, alcohol, and do you remember what? I can't remember, but there is an acronym now that we are using for other products because it's grown with e-cigarettes and some of these other things. So we'll be coming back again after we get more input from our personalized learning department and leaders around kind of merging all of that together.
So maybe the question is, we don't have a mandatory expulsion regarding tobacco then?
No, we do not.
Okay. Good enough. Director Vogel?
I just want to comment on this, that I think this is a really good step in the correct direction. And I know I've shared this before. I don't know if board members remember or not, but when we had our youth congress back in September and I sat on the group that dealt with substance abuse, and this was one of the big concerns that students brought up, was that if kids are afraid of getting expelled, they're not going to ask for help. And so I just think this is a good move. So thank you.
Very good. All right. Any other questions or thoughts regarding the first reading? Of course, we'll see this again at our next meeting to officially consider approving it as written. Any other questions or thoughts? All right, seeing none, we will move on from that to board reports. I'll just begin again with a couple of calendar dates to remind board directors that we did have to cancel again our CASB policy overhaul project, and which was scheduled for this Thursday at 4, but we will get notice out as soon as we know when that is to be scheduled. And then agenda planning is this tomorrow at 10 o'clock. I also just want to update for the board's sake as well as for public where we're going with our sub-ends that we prioritized. As you know, we prioritized really 3 that we felt were really surface as being the areas that we wanted to focus and hopefully help staff also to know that those are areas that we want to see emphasized as strategic planning is as that process unfolds. But the 3 that we prioritized included quality educators and staff have been recruited, developed, supported, retained, and celebrated. We prioritized a focused level of teamwork and professional development is ongoing among district employees, community, and law enforcement agencies to ensure the physical safety of students, district employees, and visitors. And then thirdly, we prioritized academic expectations are clearly articulated and supported with an appropriate curriculum that includes content, scope, and sequence. The next step really is for us to engage Dr. Tucker and cabinet members into a work session to really have you really talk to us about how do you interpret those end statements, those sub-ends, to really make sure that you have a grasp on what the board is intending when we say those. But also we want to begin having that conversation about how do we meaningfully monitor those 3 sub-ends. And we really want staff to be able to say, you know, in terms of quality educators, here's what we're thinking that we can collect or we can show you to demonstrate that that end indeed is a focus of ours. So I'm hoping, and I again, we'll talk about this agenda planning, but I'm hoping that we can kick that off at our next board meeting for the first part where we do a work session before we go into regular meeting, just to kind of to launch that. But board members, we may be in a position where we really need to go more in depth and may need to have, you know, a half-day work session or a full-day work session to really give staff proper time to be able to delve deeply with us about that. But that's the next step in the governance policy process, is interpretation and how is it going to be monitored. And so that is something for us to look forward to in February. But I want to pause there. Is there any reaction to that, knowing that that's kind of our next steps? Director Vogel?
So one of the things that I want to point out about that, when we get a little bit farther down the road after we've decided all those things and we set up a schedule for monitoring, our policy governance book on page 12 talks about monitoring reports. And this is just a reminder of what our role is as a board. The 1.5.5 monitoring reports due and or submitted will be on the agenda for acceptance by the board. Discussion of the reports will be only for indication of policy violations or if the board does not consider the monitoring reports to be reasonable. Other discussion of operational activities and performance will be included on the agenda only if other data indicate policy violations, if policy criteria are to be debated, or if the board for any reason chooses to amend its monitoring schedule. All that to say that I think our focus is on, we get a report to us about the progress that's being made, and this is our 30,000-foot level. And we only react and discuss when it's an indication of a violation. So I just wanted to point that out.
That's a good emphasis for us, and certainly we don't want to question the how. We want to stay with the what. And the what obviously is the in statements that we prioritize, and we really want staff to be able to define that. So thank you, Director Vogel, for reminding the perspective of where we should be. So we'll look forward to that. And that is all I have for President's Report. Director Vogel, anything for Vice President?
Sure. So Youth Initiative will have the Outstanding Youth Awards, and that is in April, and the actual date is, Monday, April 29th. Dr. Tucker is going to be be our keynote speaker, and the nomination for Outstanding Youth is open right now. That information is all linked on, I think it's all linked on the board reports. This is for students that are, have overcome some pretty significant things and are making a positive impact in their community.
Very good.
So thank you.
Thank you, Director Vogel. Any other reports from directors? Director Holtzman?
So LRPC, 2 representatives from that committee just participated in interviews for capacity consultant. And I think that our operations department and Dr. Tucker will be presenting the recommendation for that consultant at our next meeting. For CASB, we had a successful student day at the Capitol. Thank you, Director Ray and Director Vogel, for attending with us. We had, I think, 18 students. We had 20 signed up. A couple couldn't make it.
Let me just interject. Thank you, Director Holtzman, because she was the den mother of these high school students and kept them corralled. And so you had a lot of work with the logistics, and as well as Tammy and others. But thank you for doing that as well. It was a great day.
Well, it's the fun part. And another opportunity, if any board members would like to attend, will be Wednesday, February 13th, and we'll be doing a CASB Douglas County School District Parent and Community Day at the Capitol. And we have a few people signed up right now, and I believe that Tammy is helping me, and the communications department is helping me with getting that out to our SACs again, just as a reminder, and I have no doubt we'll fill our 20 spots for that too. And then I'm going to be attending the Winter Legislative Conference, and I believe Director Lemieux will also be doing that. It's just a couple of days in Denver. And looking forward to that update. And hopefully, we've heard that there's a chance the governor may be there to speak. So we'd like to hear more about the full-day kindergarten. And then lastly, RIMSL had our meeting this morning, and they are submitting the final BEST application, I believe, in about 2 weeks. And I did confirm and clarify that Douglas County School District has no financial obligation. There'll be no impact to us as to the relationship of the match percentage with the BEST grant. It doesn't affect us. They have, RIMSL's arranged for a $7.5 million debt service that will be paid by RIMSL over the next 25 years. So if you guys need more information about that when it's submitted, I'm happy to get that. And then our Tammy has been working really hard on a lot of areas to help with CASB, and also has shared with me, she's drafted kind of a list of responsibilities that she takes care of and things that that a secretary does, and she does 99.9% of them. But I haven't actually even looked at it yet, but I just wanted you guys to know that that's in process, and we're working on that. So
we're really differentiating between board secretary and a secretary for the board,
right,
which is really two different roles, and I think it's great that you guys are kind of working that out for future to delineate who owns which tasks. So that's great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Director Lemieux.
So I have a couple. FOC meeting went well. The board directives for them, the top priority is to focus on the budget. Obviously, we've got a lot of big stuff to talk about, so they're going to be focusing on that. The second one was carryover. School carryover has widely varied amounts between schools, and so they're just going to make sure that those are being spent within our policy, because we do have a policy regarding carryover. And then the third one was bond and MLO oversight. Jim Morris will be providing regular updates. He's going to be the liaison from the FOC that is on that oversight committee. And then I wanted to share some news, which is a little bit heartbreaking. We have an amazing director of the foundation of Douglas County Schools, and she's been with us for a couple of years, and she has submitted her resignation, and her last day is tomorrow. And it is on very good terms, but an opportunity came up that for personal and professional reasons she just couldn't turn down. And the entire foundation board is heartbroken to see her go. Because she has done amazing things in her short time here, notwithstanding just the books of the foundation were incredibly messy, and she did a phenomenal job working through that and getting those fixed. Obviously, their work with our chapters is a huge task of the foundation. So to have that finally making sense and moving forward. The foundation is in charge of the Career Expo. She did a great job with that. The Apple Awards were amazing, but the work that she's done to change up our Apple Awards. And now we have 2 different times that we are going to honor our employees. And I'm so excited about the changes she has made there, her vision and what she brought, the lend a hand, reach for the stars. We were able to get the Star Lab and had a great evening that night. So the community events, the foundation is such a wonderful arm for us for raising funds that are directly, positively impact our children. And so her vision, her direction, her just joy and passion and compassion for the 68,000 students in this district will be sorely missed. I'm excited for who's coming on, but I'm going to wait for that announcement later. But just Megan, if I wish you were here right now, I'd give you a hug. You have done an amazing job for this district. You'll be missed, and the folks who are getting you are lucky, lucky, lucky to have you. So best of luck to you.
Let's give Megan a video clip of us applauding her. Way to go, Megan. Megan. Yay. All right. Thank you, Director Lemieux. Other reports? Director Garziano.
Wendy, Director Vogel would mention this, but just on the bond and Oversight Committee. It was mentioned earlier that I think there was 160 applicants for the 9 different areas that we're looking to fill. So of that, just the next steps in that process, of that 160 then, the goal is to kind of narrow it down to 3 to 5 and begin interviewing those folks in the very near future to put the committee together. So an amazing, amazing number of applicants and some incredible qualifications in looking through some of those. So looking forward to getting that going.
Looking forward to hearing about a diverse group of people that comes from all different journeys. I don't know that we actually formally said Director Vogel, Director Graziano be our liaisons, but I assume board didn't have any concern, but I want to thank both of you for the time commitment that you guys are going to be engaging in here in the future, so thank you for volunteering to do that. All right, other board reports. Director Vogel?
Oh, I was just going to report that the DAC selected their representative for the Bond Oversight Committee, and it's Irene Borskov. I think I said her name right, Borisov. Sorry, Irene. And then also they are having a special UIP meeting on this Tuesday, the 29th. And that's it. And the Winter Forum. Yeah, the winter. It is on, I believe, the 12th. The 12th, yes. And it is at, I think it's at Cimarron Middle. Yep, Cimarron Middle School. And it's going to start at 5 o'clock with superintendent and board members, anybody that wants to come. It's kind of going to be like a coffee talk, ask us questions. And then the official event starts at 6. That's who, yeah, Andrew Romanoff is going to be one of the keynote speakers. I think they're still working on that. I don't know if that's been set in stone yet. Oh, it is in the flyer. Then it's a done deal. Thanks.
All right, very good. Director Chanchor, anything to add to board reports? Any others? All right, and I know we haven't been very good about meeting evaluation, but given that it is 10:30, I'm going to let us go ahead and move to adjournment. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Motion made by Director Vogel. Any second? Second by Graziano. Quick vote. Chanchor, Graziano, Holtzman, Lemieux, Lung, Ray, aye, and Vogel.
Aye.
All right, have a good evening.